Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Dylan and I'm from Seattle in Washington, where I grew up in a very stunning green leafy neighbourhood with lots of parks and sizable houses in the area, full of character, whimsical charm and aesthetic appeal. Some of them steeped in a rich, vibrant, colourful history which, much like the mature trees in our neighbourhood, stood head and shoulders above all the modern, more contemporary homes that invariably lacked that finesse, mystery and intrigue of their older counterparts. I lived here with both my parents and my sister Jennifer in a more modern, mundane, bungalow-style home. I wish I could describe myself as the perfect role model of a son, but unfortunately I was one of those impudent, rambunctious whippersnappers that was notoriously famous for getting into all kinds of scrapes and bother, causing my parents a considerable amount of grievous despair and many a sleepless night. It didn't help that I lived next door to the less than agreeable Nigel King, who was a rebellious scallywag and as mischievous as I was, and together we engaged in doing the most outrageously inappropriate things, like the super brats we invariably were. Once we both deliberately set fire to our neighbour's yard shed and hid and watched when we saw the old man, Mr. Roxburgh, running out of the house, crying out in a horrified voice, "Good grief! What the heck?" We watched in amusement as the poor man frantically tried to eliminate the flames, oscillating his arms wildly with the garden hose, while his alarmed wife quickly called out for the fire brigade, who arrived on the scene with their sparkling red fire truck and huge hoses, where they successfully extinguished the flames. We would watch these awesome lion-hearted men terminate the fire like unsung heroes, and I was in secret awe of them. "Looks like arson," said one of the firefighters. "I think someone deliberately set fire to your yard shed, Mr. Roxburgh." "But who?" said Mr. Roxburgh. "I don't have any enemies." "Well, it could be kids getting up to no end of mischief." Mr. Roxburgh sighed. "Well, then it's Dylan Scott and Nigel King. You mark my words, they're behind the spiteful, malicious stunt. I might have guessed. They're the most unruly, wayward pair at the best of times, but together they bring out the worst in each other, like putting a detonator to dynamite, if you know what I mean." Of course, Nigel and I denied profusely that we were involved or even responsible for this horseplay or practical joke, but the locals in our neighbourhood all eyed us warily, with a "we know what you did" type of looks written on their faces. It would seem we were unable to pull the wool over their judicious eyes, because somehow they sensed we were the guilty party in this tomfoolery, but we wisely admitted to nothing. I think I enjoyed the drama that Nigel and I provoked in our neighbourhood, especially when people's dismayed reactions were priceless to see, and caused us a great deal of personal amusement. Nigel and I were big on pranks, most especially scaring people half to death, like when Mrs. Abby Easton discovered a very large snake slithering around on the front seat of her car, and she screamed out in terror, her face growing a deathly white shade, and her eyes virtually bursting out of their sockets. It would seem her terrified reaction was simply priceless to watch, and Nigel and I literally ate from laughing so much. Then there was the time when my mother crushed a roach while slipping on her shoes and cried out in disgust as her feet popped the squishy insect covering her feet in a ghastly mushy goo. And when my sister opened the door and was drenched by the bucket of water she dismantled that was precariously balanced on its upper ledge, and she was less than amused to be soaked as she was dressed to the nines that evening. I remember on one occasion when the milkman was delivering milk to the locals in our area, Nigel and I got up at the crack of dawn and coloured all the milk in our Seattle neighbourhood bright pink and replaced all the caps so perfectly and precisely that you would never have guessed that they had been tampered with. I do remember the dairy got no end of phone calls from the aggrieved, rather unsettled, fretful residents in our neighbourhood, who were more than a little peevish and concerned that there was something very strange going on with the milk, as it was a rather horrific bright pink colour. Some people mistakenly thought that the dairy had botched up the order and delivered them strawberry-flavoured milk instead. "It's dreadful," said one of the disparaging residents called Abby Easton. "We can't even trust our dairy these days," she carped bitterly. "If our milk is turning pink, one can only imagine what kind of preservatives they're using in the stuff. I've a good mind to turn organic with the way things are going of late. We can't even trust our local suppliers these days. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, what on earth is this world coming to?" Nigel and I loved playing tricks on the fault-finding, scathing Abby Easton because she was one of those smug, conceited do-gooders and self-righteous people who was quick to point out other people's shortcomings and failings. It would seem she clearly didn't perceive that she had any of her own. Somehow she envisaged herself as an angel with a halo of light on her head. She was the kind of person that believed that everybody else was going to hell when they died, with herself the exception to that rule, of course. In biblical terms, she would probably have been described as a modern-day Pharisee, for she loved to be seen doing great charitable works in front of the local people, in public, of course, and, of course, honorary displays to maximise the praise and adoration she received for her generosity. Yet I've never encountered anyone in my life so judgmental, critical and reproving of others, and so quick to tear someone's character to shreds without a bye or leave. One day when my mother was having some friends over to tea for the local book club, I overheard Abby Easton garrulously nattering away about one of the locals in a very condescending tone of voice. She was referring to a woman called Ella Fitzgerald, who had taken her large poodle Wilbur to the pooch parlour to acquire a fancy puffed-up hairstyle that had made Wilbur the talk of the town. The creative, showy dog grooming done by Doris Pennington, a notable talent with exciting dog styles, invited much commentary, and Wilbur had become a showstopper or a walking work of canine art, if you like, and was admired by many. "Of course, we all know why Ella Fitzgerald is getting her poodle glammed up to the nines," sniped Abby, with an exaggerated look of disgruntled disapproval on her face. "I think she just loves all the attention she receives. I was watching her the other day, revelling in all the fuss people were paying her poodle. The woman was positively gloating. She looked so pumped up. I thought she was going to explode with pride, like a sausage bursting out of its skin. I mean, it's absolutely appalling. Why should she be dolling her dog up to be the centre of attention? You can see she's loving the pandemonium she's creating. And as for Wilbur, that dog of hers, he's as bad as she is. He seems to be thriving on the interest he's stirring up. It's almost as if he knows he's in the limelight and has somehow become a Seattle superstar. It's appalling the lengths some folks go to in order to be the centre of attention." "If I didn't know any better, Abby," my mother had piped, "I'd believe you were seriously jealous, as your large poodle has been rather overshadowed and made to appear quite plain and nondescript compared to Ella Fitzgerald's dog, and you're distinctly put out about it. I can see it in your eyes, a touch of the green-eyed monster." "Don't be ridiculous," Abby chided. "You'd never get me taking my Percy to the pooch parlour for that kind of outrageous over-the-top grooming. Percy just receives a plain cut and blow-dry from Doris Pennington, and that's all there is to it. I would never saunter around the place showing my dog off like that. It's positively insane. The woman has an ego on her the size of the Space Needle. If it gets any bigger, the whole thing will collapse." "I disagree," said my mother. "I think it's fun when people step out of a limb to be so different. It makes the world a much more exciting place." A few days later, when Abby dropped her dog off at the pooch parlour for its grooming, I phoned the parlour very successfully, impersonating Abby's husband, and informed the salon that I was desirous for my large poodle to look exactly like Wilbur. Ella Fitzgerald's poodle, but, of course, with the added touch of a bright pink rinse to her white coat. "Are you sure your wife will be happy about this?" asked Doris Pennington. "I've always considered Abby rather conservative, if you don't mind me saying so, and very safe with her doggy hairstyles, especially on Wilbur. I've never considered her the adventurous or artistic type." "Absolutely sure," I had insisted. I will never forget how everybody was whispering and giggling when Abby Easton walked her puffed-up bright pink poodle around the streets of Seattle, insisting that she had absolutely nothing to do with Percy's outrageous new hairstyle, and that Doris Pennington at the dog salon had got her wires crossed. Nobody believed a word of it. They were certain that Abby was trying to outshine Ella Fitzgerald's dog. I promise you, Abby Easton so enjoyed the attention that Percy was receiving from the Seattle residents that for as long as I can remember, she continued dyeing her poodle bright pink and giving Percy some very unique over-the-top hairstyles, and she went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that her poodle upstaged Ella Fitzgerald's dog Wilbur every single time. What was even funnier was when Ella and Abby were both paid to be on an advertisement on television to promote a special range of dog shampoos. It's incredible how Abby became the world's biggest hypocrite. Nigel and I really enjoyed causing chaos and disorder growing up, because it was infinitely more exciting for us than being well-behaved and disciplined boys that our parents longed for us to become. All my school reports would say Dylan could do a whole lot better if he applied himself. He is intent on getting up to all kinds of pranks in class and seems reluctant to concentrate. I believe your son has the potential to acquire top grades, but he refuses to make any kind of effort and is lazy, obstinate and very opinionated. So yes, Nigel and I did find ourselves getting embroiled in all kinds of trouble, and on one occasion I almost blew my hand off when the two of us made a petrol bomb, and my parents were appalled by my perilous antics that could have potentially cost me my life. When I was young, I always had the sense I was invincible, but when a couple of thrill-seeking dudes in our school lost their lives attempting a daredevil stunt, when they jumped naked into an icy cold river and ended up dying of hypothermia, I began to realise that maybe I was not quite so indestructible after all. My strange story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1993, when I was 18 years old at the time, and seemingly in love with a girl called Amanda Sanderson. The trouble is nobody liked her at all, most especially my parents, but I thought she was drop-dead gorgeous, as she was like a walking Barbie doll on the outside. But as far as her character was concerned, she was certainly lacking in the charm department, and had acquired for herself a growing army of enemies who simply despised her. But that was no skin off my nose. I didn't care what others thought about my girlfriend. Well, so I thought. I remember one evening when I retired to my bedroom, my father knocked on my bedroom door. "Can I come in, son?" he asked. "If you must," I said, secretly thinking to myself, what have I done now? My father sat awkwardly at the end of my bed, playing with his moustache ever so uncomfortably, as if he was trying to stall for time, as he meditated on what to say to me and how to handle an overreactive, very belligerent and tumultuous teenager whose moods were as changeable and as choppy as the weather. "Amanda is a very pretty girl," he said solemnly. "Yeah, and what?" I said in a sarcastic tone. "What are you getting at, Dad?" "Son," said my father, pausing for a moment, "your mother wants me to have this talk with you. We don't believe that Amanda is right for you." "Why do I care what you think about Amanda? She's my girlfriend, Dad. Get your butt out of my business, please. I don't care what you think. It's my life, and Amanda is my girlfriend, so bog off and keep your nose out of my business. My father raised his voice. Well, you should care what we think, son, because maybe your mother and I have a little more life experience behind us than you do. And if you listen to an older person, you may just receive some wise counsel that will serve you very well and be in your best interests. What's wrong with Amanda? I snapped. She's not a good person, son. Yes, looks good on the outside, with the fake eyelashes, the blonde hair, and very extensive breast augmentation going on, all that kind of thing. So I snapped, what's your point? I've heard from multiple sources that Amanda Sanderson is a very bad person. Do you know when she was a little girl, Percy Porter caught her trying to drown a whole bag of baby kittens in a lake? Luckily, he grabbed the kittens from her and managed to save their little lives. He told me he'll never forget the insidiously evil look on Amanda's face. He said she turned around and gave him a wicked grin, and for a second her pretty blue eyes went as black as coal. He said it was like he was looking at the devil himself. What stuff and nonsense, Dad, I piped. Amanda would never do something like that. It gets worse, said my father. I gather she once got an old boyfriend of hers to disable the brakes to her own father's car. Imagine that, simply because he refused to let her have plastic surgery to enhance her assets, and she was very furious. He continued, do you know her father was very lucky not to lose his life that day? He doesn't speak to Amanda anymore, as a result of the nefarious incident, and even he describes his own daughter as sick and mentally unstable. I have learnt that her own mother is afraid of her, which is why she gives Amanda everything she wants at the drop of a hat, because if she doesn't, Amanda has a tantrum and physically beats her up. Now, son, think about it. That's not normal behaviour. It would seem that she is a self-centred, spoiled, narcissistic personality type that will stop at nothing to get what she wants. Why, Dad, do you believe the lies people are telling you? They're probably just jealous because Amanda is so attractive. Is that what you really think, son? Has it not crossed your mind that people around here are looking out for your best interests because they care? You have no idea what that girl is capable of. We are exceedingly worried that you could end up in the firing line if you get on the wrong side of that girl. She could seriously hurt more than your heart, son. We're worried about you. We love you. It's our right and duty as parents to be concerned for your welfare. I put my hands over my ears. I've heard enough, Dad. Thanks, but no thanks. I'm sorry. I don't buy into all this crazy stuff. I'm old and ugly enough to make my own decisions. Now leave me alone and get out of my room. You might be old enough according to the law, son, but you're not emotionally mature yet, and you're exceedingly naive. Even your sister is disappointed in your choices of late and believes Amanda is a very bad influence on you. Get out, Dad, I snapped. I've heard enough. Thank you very much. Suffice to say, the more that my parents tried to persuade me to call things off with Amanda, the more angry, contrary and retaliatory I became, and the more inclined I was to pursue my relationship with her, even more vigorously than before, like a bull at a bullfight, getting more heated and enraged by being heckled by his antagonizer. I was bloody-minded and opinionated at the best of times, and would be damned if my parents were going to interfere in my life and tell me what to do. I was amazed when my best friend Nigel King had some less than favourable words to say about Amanda. You know we've been best friends, bro, for years, so I'm going to say it as it is. There's something about Amanda that's seriously off. Like what? I protested. Not you as well. My parents have only just given me a hard time about her. Well, I heard a rumour that Amanda was responsible for knocking down an old lady when joyriding out in her mother's car. Your girlfriend doesn't even have a driving licence, and there was a witness who came forward who swears that Amanda looked like she deliberately hit that woman. Oh, I heard about that, I said. It was a terrible accident, that's all. And the old lady was fine in the end, so what's the big deal? Tell yourself that as much as you like, bro, said Nigel, but it doesn't change a thing. I still think Amanda is a nutter, that's all. She's not right in the head. And the only thing Amanda cares about is Amanda, and stuff everybody else. I'm not going to pretend that I wasn't slightly troubled and perturbed by people's less than favourable opinions about Amanda, but I was crazy about her, and completely infatuated. I'd never been out with such a wild card before. Amanda was flamboyant and completely over the top, and I think I was like a pathetic puppy dog as far as she was concerned, as I was beguiled, bedazzled and seemingly intoxicated by the exotic blonde bombshell. That was all about to change, in ways I would have never envisaged possible. It all began when I was planning a trip to a forested area in Washington state for a camping weekend with Amanda, an idea that did not bode well with my very guarded parents. I could hear them discussing me behind their backs, and I eavesdropped in on their conversation. He's young and impressionable, piped my mother. He's completely obsessed and smitten by Amanda. There's nothing we can do about it. I think this camping weekend is not a bad idea, as Dylan might just wake up to find out exactly what Amanda is all about. There's nothing like a stark bit of reality to wake up a young man and help him to smell the coffee. I'm not sure you're right, said my father. Amanda appears to have her sharp claws embedded in our son like an eagle's talons. He's acting like a robot, almost eager to do her every bidding, as if she has him under some kind of a trance or spell or mind control, if you like. It worries me that she might set him up to get involved in something nefarious that he'll later regret. Sweetheart, I do get where you're coming from, but we can't spoon-feed our son, nor live his life for him. We can't stop him from making mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes, and he'll learn from them. I'm sure he'll be fine in the end. I was really peeved off to hear my parents talk about Amanda in such a disagreeable way, but a voice in my gut told me to pay attention to what my parents were saying. I didn't want to listen to that warning voice, as no teenage boy wants to admit that their parents might just be right on the money. Before long, Amanda and I were out on the open road, taking the 2.5-hour journey towards an area of national forest where we intended to go camping. Amanda was sitting in the front seat, blowing and popping bubblegum balloons in her mouth, and giggling for most of the journey, while we happily bopped around in the car to some of our favourite musical tracks, throwing our arms around the place as we swayed our upper torsos to the music and tapped our legs on the rubber footwear of the car. I was feeling very happy, until suddenly Amanda asked if she could drive. You haven't got your driving licence, I reminded her. You know you're not supposed to drive. Look what happened when you were joyriding in your mum's car. Big deal, she said. I've been driving since I was a little girl. I know how to drive. Come on, Dylan. Don't be such a wet blanket. All right, I said. But if you drive dangerously, I'll be back in the driver's seat like a shot. And that's a promise. It wasn't long before Amanda was driving down a dirt road when a dog ran out in front of the car. It would have been easy for Amanda to stop the car to allow the dog to cross the road, but instead she pressed down the accelerator and speeded up and began to giggle as if it was a big joke. I could discern the ominous thud of something hitting the car, and I could feel the nausea rising up in the back of my throat. I wanted to be violently sick, as I knew Amanda had deliberately run over the dog. How could she do this despicable, deplorable thing? Nobody normal behaves like this. We stopped the car, and I shrieked at Amanda, "What the heck have you done? You could have stopped for the dog." Amanda parked the car on the side of the road, and I raced over to the poor whimpering dog. He was going to be all right, I said to Amanda. You just ran over the leg. We can take it to the vet. I began to stroke the beautiful Rhodesian Ridgeback, reassuring it. It's all right, boy. I'll get you some help. The dog looked up at me with grateful eyes, seemingly comforted and reassured by my calming voice. Before I could think about the next course of action, Amanda had retrieved my revolver from the glove compartment of the car and placed the rifle on the dog's head, killing it at point-blank range. I was mortified and appalled. "What the heck did you do that for, Amanda?" I piped. "We could have saved this dog's life. I was about to take it to the vet. It would have made a full recovery. What on earth were you thinking?" "Oh, please," she said. "It's just a silly mutt." "Amanda, that could be someone's beloved dog," I piped. "Who cares?" she said. "We put him out of his misery." In that moment, the magical potion that had made me believe that Amanda was the most gorgeous woman that had ever graced the face of the earth just suddenly dissipated like the smoke from a chimney and blew away. Now her blonde hair and pretty blue eyes were contaminated by this vulgar ugliness, and in an instant I failed to find anything remotely attractive about her. To me it was as if the blinders had come off my eyes, and I realised that Amanda was a monster, and this unmasked woman sitting next to me was now quite possibly the most hideously grotesque, evil, repugnant and ugly woman that I'd ever seen in my entire life. "You know what, Amanda," I said. "Let's give this camping trip a miss. I think we should go back home. I don't feel good." "What the heck is wrong with you?" snapped Amanda. "You are now so embittered because of a pathetic dog. Are you really that lame? We're going camping, and that's final. I've been looking forward to this trip, and no one in this world is going to spoil it for me, not even you." I sat there in my car, persuading myself that I could manage a weekend with Amanda, but when I returned home, if I ever saw her again, it would be way too soon. "Oh, here we are," said Amanda, taking a swift turn down a rugged, precipitous road where my car was bumping precariously all over the place. I bit my lip tightly, as I wanted to protest at the atrocious way Amanda was driving my car, but I thought better of creating more discord between us, as things were already overheated. Finally we parked the car in a rather remote car park that was overgrown with weeds, creeping through the tarmac, and it looked so vacant and badly maintained, as if it hadn't been used in years. It must have taken about 3 hours of exhausting, solid, steep uphill walking as we trekked through the meadows of flowers, past a large silvery lake, and then began ambling through a vast wooded area that was so stunningly beautiful that I was completely transfixed. The trees were so old and mature, they towered up into the sky like imposing giants with the grace of ballet dancers, and the shaded canopy that arched over our heads emitted a gentle light through the branches of the trees that dappled the floor in a subtle luminescence. I was completely bedazzled by this rich verdant oasis, where even the large voluptuous boulders and shapely tree trunks were swathed extravagantly in a sumptuous velvety green moss. There were lacy, delicate ferns and colourful wild spring flowers springing through the brush, brightening up the woods in splashes of pinks, violets and blues, like the bright colours on an artist's palette. This exquisite, peaceful sanctuary was alive with pretty birdsong, and we even discerned squirrels and chipmunks scurrying up the trees, eyeing us ever so curiously as we made our presence known. Soon we found a shelter on the edge of the woods, on an extensive clearing on a high elevation that overlooked the bewitching valley below, where we could observe the large silvery lake, flanked by a huge imposing mountain and heavily fringed by alpine trees. Many campers had been here before us, but not for a long time, as even the fire pits appeared dismantled, as if they had not been used for a long while. "It's beautiful here," I said, taking out my binoculars and viewing the lake in the valley below. It gleamed in the noonday sun, reflecting the trees and the mountain on its shimmering silver surface, rather like a sparkling mirror. We hitched up our tent and prepared a fire pit, and it seemed as if time was accelerated speedily, much like the remote control of a television on fast forward. For soon the sun set over the valley in a magnificent fold of gold and pink and tangerine, only to be eclipsed very dramatically by the prompt arrival of the dusky night and the resplendent silvery displays of the glittering stars, along with a very bright luminescent moon. As we ate our spicy chicken kebabs, I asked Amanda why her relationship with her father was on tender hooks, and why they'd fallen out so badly. "My father told me that your boyfriend disabled your father's brakes in the car because he'd refused to allow you to have plastic surgery." I watched as Amanda chewed her chicken kebab. "Yeah? So, big deal?" You mean you did get your ex-boyfriend to disable his brakes? I asked in horror. You could have killed him, Amanda, and this is your father we're talking about. Your very own flesh and blood. Have you seen my father? Piped Amanda. He's a real loser. He deserved everything he got. Even if that is true, Amanda, you do realise that if your father had died, you would have been culpable for murder. You're lucky your father never turned you in to the police. You could have got yourself into some serious trouble. Oh, please stop the melodramatics, Dylan. Change the record. I'm bored of this subject. That night I lay in my sleeping bag, with my eyes wide open. I was a complete and utter idiot. My parents were absolutely right. Amanda was a treacherously evil person. She was duplicitous, deceitful and guileful, and she was only interested in herself. Why had I been so beguiled and deceived by her attractive veneer? Was I so shallow that I'd allowed a woman to manipulate me like this, just on her alluring physical appearance, without being able to really discern the hideous state of her heart? Was I that immature, ignorant and naive? I wrestled with the images of Amanda in my mind, and fleeting memories came flashing back like the pictures on a video recorder, where I recalled times when she had shown her true colours to me. I had chosen to ignore the foul, brutal words that had emanated from her sharp tongue, that were cruel, toxic, unkind and mean, where she had demeaned and undermined people in my presence. I had turned a blind eye to it all. What on earth was I thinking? It was clear my head had been in the clouds, and I had failed to see what was in plain sight. I could hear Amanda's gentle snores, and then in a trice it would seem that I had sunk into the world of dreams myself, only to be awoken and disturbed by strange, anomalous noises outside our tent. I sat up in alarm. I could hear feet dislodging stones around the clearing as something very sizable walked around our campsite, almost deliberately kicking up the stones. The footfall was thunderous and far heavier than that of a man, but it did sound bipedal. What could it be? Imagine my surprise when our whole tent wobbled precariously from one side to another, as if it was facing the wrath of a punnelling wind. But there was no wind on this night. Someone was outside our tent, shaking it backwards and forwards like a boat on a tempestuous, turbulent and choppy sea. I could feel my heart thundering violently through my chest. What the heck was going on, I wondered. All of a sudden I heard what I can only describe as snorting sounds, rather reminding me of a horse when it breathes very deeply. Now I was certain we were dealing with a bear rampaging around our tent. I breathed a huge sigh of relief when I suddenly heard the heavy footfall walking away and leaving our campsite. I stealthily tried to wiggle out of my sleeping bag and manoeuvre myself out of the tent, but the critter, whatever it in God's name it was, appeared to be standing only yards away from me, and turned around, having obviously picked up the vibrations of my movement with its very sharp ears. I could see a pair of bright red eyes staring at me from 8 feet off the ground. Oh my God, I thought, what in God's name is that? For in the darkness the critter was the scariest, most terrifying thing that I have ever beheld in my life. The intimidating critter stood erect, proud and tall, like the trunk of a very large tree. It manoeuvred its shoulders and head to face me. For a while we stared at each other. It was almost as if the critter's eyes had a hypnotic hold on me, for I was drawn into them, like the milk being sucked up a straw. The creature appeared human, but it wasn't human in fullness, for there was ape-like influences to its anatomy. For a start, the pyramid head shape rather reminded me of the mountain gorillas of Rwanda that I'd so often seen in documentaries, along with the overlong arms and the powerful muscular definition so vividly pronounced in the critter's stocky build. Yet the body was shaped like a man, but in a giant-like interpretation, and the face was so human, but the dark shadows of the night obscured many of its features. I could also discern that the critter was covered in long flowing hair that appeared of a dark colour, but what exact shade it was I'm not certain, for in my experience auburns and browns can sometimes appear almost black at night. As I was staring at the critter in awe, I do believe in those seconds that my fear had been hijacked by my complete shock at seeing something that appeared incongruous to our reality, for indeed the critter looked so out of place that I was mindful to believe I might actually be dreaming. I could sense the critter meant me no harm, as it suddenly turned around to glide back into the woods from whence it had come. Unbeknown to me, Amanda had spied the critter from the window of our tent, and ran out of our tent, firing shots after it to scare it away. But her reactions backfired on us both very gravely. All of a sudden the critter turned around and thundered towards our tent, like a maddened rhino in full charge, for Amanda had provoked the critter to rage. It was now furious, and its mouth curled back to reveal its oversized human teeth, and the critter made the most dreadful growl that caused the hair on the back of my neck to stand on end, and I could feel this ominous cold chill engulf my entire being. I now knew that I was living on borrowed time, because this critter was going to definitely kill us. The critter was only standing yards away from us, and circling us like a lion that is surveying its prey that it's about to pounce upon. All of a sudden, Amanda pushed me very hard towards the critter, so that I fell on the ground and was only yards away from him. I could have touched his ankles with my hands. Amanda then ran through the woods as fast as she could, determined to save her own skin, and offer me as a sacrifice to the critter. To my amazement, the critter left me alone, and ran directly after Amanda, and I could hear her shooting after it and screaming, and then the screaming subsided, and everything became eerily silent, and then the critter thundered back through the woods, passing our camping site, and glancing at me briefly as it sped off out of sight. I was certain that Amanda was dead, but imagine my amazement when I found her on the ground, cursing and swearing. "What happened?" I asked. Amanda looked surprised to see me in one piece, as I think she believed that the critter had probably killed me. "What happened?" I repeated. "The critter grabbed the gun from me and threw it somewhere here in the brush. It then picked me up and looked me directly in the eyes. It looked right through me and growled. It then threw me in the air like a ball, but it caught me. I've never been so scared in all my life. I thought it was going to kill me, Dylan. But then it put me on the ground lightly and glided away. You do realise you caused all this chaos, Amanda? I think he was curious about us, that's all. He was leaving our campsite when you shot at him. What on earth were you thinking?" "I want to get out of here now," said Amanda. "I can't abide staying in the woods a moment longer, not with that monster around." To cut a long story short, you'll be glad to know that I promptly ended my relationship with Amanda, much to my parents' delight. I never ever heard from her for many long years, but I had heard idle gossip that she had spent a long stint in jail and was now completely estranged from her family. At this stage of my life, I was happily married to my beautiful wife Susanna and our 2 gorgeous children. One day I was at the food aisle at Walmart doing some shopping for my wife Susanna to find myself being poked by a very overlarge, rough, masculine-looking woman with excessively large biceps, lots of black tattoos, and several rings in her nose. "Hello, Dylan," she said. "Long time no see. It must have been years since we last saw each other." I felt very embarrassed because I didn't recognise this woman. Who on earth was she, I wondered. "Sorry," I said. "I don't mean to be rude, but do I know you?" The woman looked rather offended. "Dylan, it's me. Don't you remember? Amanda Sanderson. We were an item once. Surely you haven't forgotten." As you can imagine, I was stunned, because Amanda Sanderson had morphed from a Barbie doll into a sumo wrestler. How was that even possible? "It's been a long time," I agreed, "but of course I haven't forgotten you." "It's been too long," she said. "We've had some good times together, you and I. So what you been doing?" "Well, I'm very happily married, and I have 2 children." "Nice," she said. "Very nice." "What about you?" I asked. "What have you been doing?" "Well, I got robbing a bank with an ex-boyfriend of mine. Not a good influence, I have to say. Spent a stint in jail. Wasn't pretty. 9 years for my trouble, that's what I got. Then I did another stint in jail. Never learnt my lesson. Committed fraud with another boyfriend. So, in all, it has been a bit of a rough road. Oh dear, I said. Not good. Do you remember the critter we encountered on that camping trip, she asked me. How could I forget, I said. Well, I told all my jail buddies our story, but no one believed a word of it. They said I was making the whole thing up for attention. Well, it is an outlandish story, I agreed. Unless you were there, it is rather hard to believe. You do realise we saw a Bigfoot? Well, yes, I have gathered that, I said. At that she promptly said goodbye. And then I discovered her arm in arm, walking down the aisle with another woman who looked even more masculine than she did. It looked like they were a couple. So if there is any moral to this story, my advice to you is if you are young and impressionable like I was, just remember if the book cover is exceedingly attractive, it doesn't necessarily mean the book is good at all. And even an attractive book can lose its gloss. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I'm trying to suppress my laughter. Really I am. But it's an internal tug-of-war, a battle with my zygomatic facial muscles that is so easily defeated. I can't help myself. Despite my restraint, my muscles around my mouth loosen, the corners of my lips twitch, collapsing under the pulling pressure, gliding upwards like a piece of elastic band being stretched to full capacity. Then, despite my very best efforts to remain stoically indifferent, a huge amused grin has burst forward on my face, like the sunshine on a cloudy day. Worse still, an offensive snort, followed by a cacophony of cocky laughter, discharges itself from the back of my throat impromptu. Whoops, I certainly didn't mean that to happen. It makes me appear arrogantly rude. I know it does. Condescending even. The estate agent is frowning up at me. She's putting her hands on her hips in a defiant, defensive gesture. Can't say I blame her, really. I've only gone and laughed in her face, and that never is received well at the very best of times, especially not from a woman who is profoundly serious, like she clearly is. I imagine she would privately relegate me to the list of her most obnoxious, discourteous clients that she's encountered over the years. But I'm not intentionally, audaciously ill-mannered as a person. On the contrary, I consider myself to be quite a gentleman, really. I know my unbridled laughter has caused offence, but I mean, what this woman is spouting through her blowhole like a beluga whale basking in the ocean is all but a bunch of baloney. Is she really expecting me to take a word of what she's saying seriously? Are you kidding me? Indeed, the way she's talking is so ludicrously preposterous and insanely farcical. I can't help myself but be amused. I mean, does she really believe I'm going to buy into all this hocus-pocus stuff and nonsense? How old does she think I am? 38, going on 5. I grew out of fairy tales a long time ago, I assure you. I'm a pragmatic, level-headed, logical man, with my feet firmly embedded on the ground. I'm closing in my late 30s, for goodness sake. Does she really expect me to believe this nonsensical mumbo-jumbo? It would seem so, judging by the reproachful, reproving expression on her face. "You think this is terribly funny, Mr. Warrington? I can see that," she says, looking at me through her steely, disparaging blue eyes that don't suffer fools gladly. She's clearly been an estate agent for a long period of time. She thinks she's sussed me out like all of her other clients, but no, she has not. I can see she's a tough old bird. I say old as even though she's middle-aged, with a short crop of blonde hair, done in a stylish shaggy pixie cut, with a plethora of layers to enhance its fullness. I discern she has a slender physique, tightly tucked away behind a modest formal black pantsuit. I think the years have robbed her of some of her youth, as her features are now hardened, angular, rather sharp, as the buoyant fullness of her cheeks has clearly been punctured like a beach ball, so her flattened skin now clings tightly to her face. There's pronounced frown lines in the middle of her eyebrows, along with a few crow's feet dappling the edges of her blue eyes, but those are not unattractive. They show me she's lived. She was terribly pretty once, I think. Not any more, although she is attractive, of course, but I imagine it's probably customers like myself, that like the cantankerous ocean waves have beat against her incessantly with all their challenging demands. It can take a lot out of a person, you know. Let's not kid. Life can be very taxing. We all know that. Some people can quite literally drain you of all your energy. I've seen it in my line of work all the time. My mother used to call them energy vampires. You'll spend time with them, and then once they've gone, you're so exhausted, so incredibly drained. I hope I'm not doing that to this poor woman's energy. I clandestinely suspect that I may be doing just that, which is the last thing I want to do. But does she really expect me to take her seriously? I battle my amused expression by banishing it as quickly as I can from my face, wearing now what I hope is a serious, sombre expression, which is much more agreeable to her. I'm only telling you this, Mr. Warrington, as I have your best interests at heart, as this house has been through over 20 owners in the last 10 years. Now that's not good. People move in here, and sometimes 3 or 4 months later, they just sell up like that. Now I know it's a beautiful home. People are always fighting to buy it. It's very easy to sell a person a house like this because you fall in love with it so easily. It has historic integrity, charm, character. But once people move into this house, they're all too eager to escape. I have to warn you, it is definitely haunted. And whether you believe it or not, it's true. I've interviewed some of the former owners of this place, and they have all reported very disturbing activity, which unsettled them greatly. They had to move away. Many describe encountering a malevolent, bodeful, dark energy, telling them to get the hell out of the house. It scares the bejesus out of them, as you can fully appreciate. She hesitates for a brief moment, almost as if to gauge my reaction, but my impassioned expression remains very fixed, without a glimmer of amusement on my face. So, encouraged by my more respectful demeanour, she continues, "People are never comfortable with what they don't understand. I'm only mentioning this to you, Mr. Warrington, as you referred to your wife as being pregnant, and you also have a young 4-year-old girl, who I'm sure is obsequiously impressionable and easily exploitable, certainly by dark energy she would be. At that young age they can see into other realms. It's a proven fact. I'm not sure this is an appropriate house for raising a young family. I mean, if your wife is pregnant, this is indeed a vulnerable time for her, especially with a baby growing in her womb. In my opinion, she needs to be in a secure, safe place, where she's not exposed to these treacherous supernatural stresses. If you take my advice, you will allow me to take you to view some other houses on my listings, Mr. Warrington, that will be much more suitable for your family's needs. Now, if it's a historic property you're looking for, there is one not far from here. It's the real deal, a fabulous colonial. You'll just love it." "I'm very sorry, Miss Ferris. I know you mean well," I say, raising my hand to stop her yapping on and on about a house I certainly don't want. "I've decided that this is the house I want. I think this house has stolen all the thunder from its competitors, and I'm sold on the place. As I keep saying, I know your heart is in the right place, and I certainly appreciate your very great kindness. But the moment I laid my eyes on this place, I knew it was the one for me and my family, and I'm rather sold on it." "I was worried you were going to say that," says the estate agent, frowning at me. "Do you know, Mr. Warrington, I have to beat people off buying this place, and I do get why they love it so much. It oozes charm. But I don't want you to regret this decision of yours, and I am very concerned about your wife." "Don't you worry about me, Miss Ferris. I'm old and ugly enough to manage my mistakes, when and if I should make them. I don't think this property is a mistake, although I will confess I have made many mistakes over my life." "But aren't you a teensy-weensy bit worried about the high turnover of people that have bought this house? I mean, surely you can perceive that this is more than a coincidence, Mr. Warrington. It's clear to me you don't buy into the idea of this place being haunted. But does it not give you a pause for thought that so many people abandoned this place after only a few months of living here? People like you, who fell in love with the place and couldn't get away fast enough after they'd bought it." "No, it doesn't, Miss Ferris. I'm not other people. I can't speak for them or for their actions, but I can for mine, and so I would like to put an offer in for the house if I may.
I might remind you it's your job to encourage people to buy houses, not to turn them away.
Look, Mr. Warrington, I can see your heart is so sold on the place. But don't you dare come crying to me or complaining if it all goes south, says Miss Ferris in a no-nonsense schoolmistress-like voice. I just like people to know exactly what they're getting into, that's all, so there are no nasty surprises along the way. I wouldn't be doing my job properly if I didn't warn you. The estate agent, Miss Ferris, stands outside her Nissan truck, watching me through her large, glamorous Gucci sunglasses. I climb warily back into my car, my back gratefully sinking into the soft leather seats. I slam the door gently behind me, feeling the estate agent's eyes fixed on me like a beady hawk. If she doesn't know it, she's shaking her head rather profusely. I imagine she thinks I'm a bloody fool for not taking her judicious advice seriously. But I am no fool. I never make impromptu decisions without thinking about them studiously and weighing all the options in my mind. As far as I was concerned, there was no sense of foreboding or dark energy in that house that I could discern. I didn't pick up any ethereal, spooky, ghostly or outer-worldly presence in the house. On the contrary, the house was warm, convivial, inviting, uplifting, and very welcoming. I sigh warily as I tune into Z100 radio, as dealing with Miss Ferris was literally like persevering with an unwanted flapping pigeon that you're trying desperately to evacuate from the house. An irritant, not to put too fine a point on it. I plunge the key into the lock, switch on the engine of my car, and wave at Miss Ferris, while driving away with my hand steering the car away smoothly down the undulating driveway. I can see Miss Ferris through my rear-view mirror. Her brow is furrowed, her face wearing a frown. I reflect over my conversation with her. I hasten to say this has got to be the most peculiar interaction that I've ever had with an estate agent before, where I literally had to fight for the property that I wanted to buy. And hello, I am actually the customer, in case the woman has forgotten. Has she deserted the age-old rule that the customer is always right, and what the customer wants, the customer gets? Or had that conveniently just bypassed her mind? Somehow I suspected it had. I was now driving back to Portland. The dream house I had put an offer on was situated close to the Columbia River Gorge, not far from the rural small towns of Hood River and the Dales. Currently my family was living in an attractive apartment in the Pearl District that was masterfully transformed from an old warehouse into a loft conversion by an up-and-coming, very successful architect. It was located in a fabulous area, and don't get me wrong, me and my wife thoroughly enjoyed living there. I've always loved a place to bear the indelible footprints of bygone times, like slippers worn from the past. The Pearl District in Portland definitely does bear the hallmarks of a rich, very vibrant history. Sometimes if I close my eyes tightly enough, I can see men from a long-forgotten generation, literally walking down those streets, in their full-skirted knee-length coats, breeches, waistcoats, while sporting debonair, elegant but classic top hats on their heads, while the women boast a glamorous ensemble of corsets, bustle skirts and bonnets, all made out of exquisite-looking fabrics. I can even visualize the horse and buggies meandering down the bumpy contours of the street in the 1800s. Ironically, I have friends here in the Pearl District that swear they sometimes wake up in the middle of the night or the early hours of the morning to hear horses' hooves trotting down the cobblestones at the most nonsensical hours, and these friends of mine are not inclined to be delusional, so the echoes of the past can be clearly felt by all who live here. The Pearl District used to be the warehouse district, with loading docks and cobblestone streets. It was known as the Industrial Triangle, with shunting yards and weather-beaten buildings. Nowadays, these industrial buildings have been converted into trendy shops, chic lofts, artisan coffee shops, fine dining, and fabulous boutiques. My wife would have accompanied me today to observe this countryside property, but her morning sickness was out of control, so we decided it was better that she stayed at home with our 4-year-old daughter Sophie. My wife was only 5 months pregnant, and this morning sickness had dominated her entire pregnancy to date, and it looked like it was here to stay through the entire course of her pregnancy, like the proverbial boomerang. Ironically, when my wife was pregnant with Sophie,
She had breezed through that pregnancy so seamlessly, like a sailboat on calm waters, without a hint of turbulence. Everything in that pregnancy had been so easy, almost too easy. Now it was almost as if her body had mercilessly saved up all its wrath for this pregnancy. By all accounts, my wife was now rarely suffering, with vindictive, cruel bouts of morning sickness that held her hostage to her own self-induced incarceration, as leaving home, even for a spate of grocery shopping, was not even an option for her, as any bumpy movements caused by travel would have my wife hurling up her guts. By all accounts, it was left up to me to manage the affairs of the home front as well as the office, and help us to find an ideal location to live, as my wife was worn out, frazzled, exhausted, and perpetually nauseous. I'd never seen her look so washed out, so pale, so tired. Some people described her as a walking zombie. They weren't far wrong. We had decided we wanted to move outside the Pearl District, to a countrified, tranquil location, where we could raise our children in a wholesome, rustic, more rural environment, where Mother Nature could also provide some nurturing maternal sustenance to them. I certainly loved the idea of being able to see the billowing curvatures of the mountains gliding up so graciously into the skyline every morning, under the canopy of a cobalt blue sky, along with the surrounding rugged sculptural terrain, where jagged rocks angrily jutted out of the landscape, littered with Douglas firs and eastern hemlocks, while sword ferns, rhododendrons, Oregon grape, and twin flowers would scatter themselves liberally under the forest canopy. I could commute to the city a couple of days a week, although fortunately much of my work could be done from home, online, with conference calls and so forth. This was the quintessential, brand new start in life that my family needed. I had grown up near the gateway of the Ozarks, so for me I felt my children should be raised close to the natural world. As for me personally, growing up so close to nature had deeply enriched my life, as breathing in all that crisp country air, exploring the natural environment while drinking in awe-inspiring views had been such a pleasure, one that I didn't want to deprive my own children of in the crucial stages of their development. These days, of course, with the advent of social media platforms like WhatsApp and Twitter, many kids are almost superglued to their cell phones, and for me personally, I thought this was no way for them to live. Technology has its advantages and place, but certainly when it consumes and robs your life, like a blood-sucking leech or time-sucking vampire, it is definitely not a good thing. If my children needed anything in life, it was not to be wholly dependent on technology, as there is indeed life beyond the airwaves. When I'd laid my eyes upon Willow Creek House, I had fallen in love with the location at once. Large iron gates opened up to a long asphalt driveway that led towards the most beguiling symmetrical farmhouse that I'd ever seen, where roses tumbled like laughter over the front entrance of the home. I was to learn that the original 1800s farmhouse that had stood on this prime location had been in such a bad state of repair. It had been subsequently demolished about 25 years ago, but a fine architect had recreated the old building and revived the history of the home, using quality materials to reproduce an almost identical copy of the original farmhouse. Let's just say it seemed to be marinated in a rich, vibrant history, as if it had been resurrected from the grave itself and brought back to life again, which had been the general idea of the original builder. The whitewashed classical farmhouse was long and square, with several arched sash windows on the upper and lower elevations, a very ornate black shiny door, a black slate roof, with a wraparound porch that snuggled itself cosily around the house, like a very large, effusive hug. It sounds pretty mainstream, I know, and rather bland as I describe it, but in reality the house was absolutely gorgeous. It would easily stand out in any crowd. It had a life of its own. It breathed personality, oozed charm like dribbling honey, character like a sweet flowery bouquet, and was congenial like a sincere, warm-hearted friend. It seemed wizened and mature, like a Californian redwood tree that has bounded through the generations like a buoyant rubber ball, and seen so much, too much perhaps. Maybe that was why I was so attracted to this gorgeous house. I loved places that had a nostalgic, wistful, flamboyant, palpable history, which was why I was drawn to living in the Pearl District in the first place. I loved how the house was nestled so comfortably in the heart of a prepossessing verdant hilly valley, surrounded by pretty meadows, sculptural rugged outcrops, a plethora of trees that sprawled out into a large arresting woodgrove, where there was a babbling creek, sporting its own wrought-iron, highly ornate white bridge. If that wasn't enough for you, the farmhouse boasted some very accommodating outbuildings, which included a substantial red barn and a stable block, a faint suggestion, or subtle insinuation perhaps, that at one time we might consider buying a couple of American quarterback horses, which was definitely on the cards in the not-too-distant future. I decided I would not mention to my wife Morag about the estate agent's nonsensical claims that the house was haunted. I decided to leave those abstract, ethereal, and insubstantial things left unsaid, as the last thing I wanted to do was to put a spanner in the works and cause my wife unwarranted upset, which she didn't need in her pregnancy, as it could have expendable ramifications for the baby growing in her womb. My wife believed in ghosts and things that go bump in the night, although she'd never been exposed to any paranormal activity, but she was intuitive and much more spiritually inclined than I was. My wife Morag's account. The first time I laid my dewy, rather sentimental eyes on Willow Creek House, let's just say I felt as if I was transported back in time to the 1800s, even though this house, I was told, had replaced the original farmhouse that had once stood on this exact piece of land, but had been bulldozed as it was in a bad state of repair. In truth, it looked so legitimate that if you'd told me it was the original farmhouse, I would have absolutely believed you. There was nothing about this house that led me to believe it had been recently built, apart from one predominant factor, of course, and that was it was in remarkably good condition, with not the wear and tear or inevitable problems you would expect to arise in a more older home that constantly demands maintenance to keep it in tip-top condition. Suffice to say, the house was pure poetry, or a romantic, evocative song, if you like. It looked as if it had always been nestled there, comfortably in the valley, for 300 years and beyond. It looked like it belonged. Yes, I think that's an excellent word for me to use. This dreamy house belonged to the environment, like a purse belongs with a pair of matching shoes. The house had relaxed roots that anchored themselves securely and comfortably in the ground. It didn't look like your standard run-of-the-mill symmetrical building. This house was uniquely special. It was alive. I loved the billowing trail of red roses that clung to the outer front wall of the house, bespeckling the walls with their delicate, ethereal, perfumed blossoms. I felt as if the house was wrapping me in her arms with such a warm welcome. It felt like home. That's right, it felt like home. If I'm laying my cards on the table and baring my heart to you and being blatantly honest, I would tell you that my husband surprised me. I would never have envisaged him capable of picking out a dream property like this for us, but he did, and furthermore he excelled himself in the process. Let's just say at the time I was far too sickly to actually care about where the hell we actually lived. My morning sickness had crippled my life, holding me to ransom, to an inactive, lackadaisical lifestyle spent on the couch. I don't believe I could have done better myself in selecting a more promising home for our family. This reassuring house was like a charmed fairy tale, with viridescent green meadows spread out from beyond the property, where the knee-high grass danced against a still breeze, fringed in the furthest distance by the towering vertical silhouettes of the ponderosa pines and Douglas fir trees. The light of the sun caressed its shadows on the house with a twinkling, vibrant warmth. It was so beautiful, and yes, I admit I was transfixed by the house. My little daughter Sophie was running around the property, her ebullient face a picture of joy. "Mummy, I love this house. This is the best place to play with my dolls. Look, Molly, Mummy, she says that this is the best new home. This is our new home. Mummy, Molly's just told me she loves our house. But she thinks you must buy me a horsey." "Does she now?" I say, smiling down at Sophie. "Well, we'll see about that, sweetheart," I say affectionately, ruffling her curly blonde ringlets that frame her cute baby face affectionately. When I enter the house, I gasp in astonishment. The movers have been and gone. My husband was such a gem, so attentively thoughtful. He hired a team of conscientious, industrious people to map out the furniture all around the property, so I didn't have to do a thing or lift a finger, as even the boxes dropped off by the delivery men have been punctiliously and painstakingly unpacked and put away, with an assiduous attention to detail. My husband knew I'd been through hell and back during this pregnancy, and wanted to make this move as stress-free as possible, and he succeeded. In truth, it had all been so exhausting. Well, my pregnancy, that is. They always say that women blossom through their pregnancy. Please give me a break. Do they say that to make us pregnant women feel better? Because if they do, it's not working. I just don't buy into that theory, not for a single moment. Maybe some people do, but it never happened to me. In truth, I feel like a hippopotamus, and when people ask me if they can feel my belly, I cringe in horror, not because I care about them touching my belly, but it's during these moments I'm always reminded of how enormous I have become. When I look at myself in the mirror, it seems impossible to believe that I could ever be my pre-birth size and weight again. My former slenderness has abandoned and deserted me like a bird on the wind, and my fat cells are literally throwing parties like rambunctious squirrels storing away a plethora of nuts for a rainy day, instructing my fat cells to store, and store. I tried to put my jeans on the other day, and my heart sank. I could barely get them up my legs. It was heartbreaking. It's not even as if I've eaten very much during this pregnancy, as I've been throwing up most of the time. But still my body is laying down fat stores, as if insulating the house for winter. By the way my body is looking at the moment, I would hazard a guess that my fat cells have clearly decided that it will be a very icy cold winter indeed, which means more and more insulation is clearly needed and invited to generously layer itself around my body. Just lovely. It's all I need. Of course my husband tells me I look wonderful, but then he's been a perfect charmer, has he not? And I suppose his generous lies cushion the blow of how rarely bad I do look. Needless to say, he has redeemed himself somewhat by buying this house for us, and all I need to do now is lift up my feet, as my husband has taken away all the back-breaking work for me. Things would be wonderful if my pregnancy wasn't so tumultuous, but it really is a troubling pregnancy. It was after being in the house for a few days that strange, rather enigmatic things began to happen. I kept reassuring myself that my brain had become filled with hot air, or cauliflower, and my memory become like a sieve. Don't you worry, yes, I've heard all about pregnancy brain. I mean, not only does your body become like a hippo, but your brain becomes all flaky and unreliable. That's all we need. I would put my car keys on the entrance hall desk, only to find them in my purse a while later, and I knew I'd put them on the desk. So why were they in my purse? I had no recollection of putting them there. I would return to my bedroom, wondering why my bed covers had been straightened, when moments before they were ruffled. I would smell violets in the bedroom on many occasions. It was bizarre. I didn't have a fragrance like that. I even began to ask myself if the brand of washing powder that I was using had been injected with a new, rather pleasing fragrance, which was far more attractive than some of the more synthetic creations. Since we moved into our house, my daughter Sophie also seemed to be busily entertained, which was extremely unusual and idiosyncratic behaviour for her. She was an energetic child that often demanded my undivided attention, but not any more. Something else was clearly entertaining her. It was all rather convenient for me, I hasten to say, because I could sit back on the couch with Gulliver, our ginger Tom, lying strewn across my stomach, like a very fat red scarf, keeping my belly lovely and warm, and his fur insulating me. He would purr profusely, sometimes pawing at my belly, as if he was playing with my unborn baby, which was rather amusing to watch. Well, it was, until he started clawing my skin, leaving a few nasty scratches behind. I'd often hear my daughter Sophie, her tumbling laughter, echo around the high ceilings of the house, and it did get me wondering somewhat. I remember sitting up from my book, listening and thinking, I'd never heard my daughter laugh quite so much. She seemed unusually content to remain in her bedroom, playing with her dolls, something she'd normally not ever do. But these days her behaviour had changed significantly. Well, don't put her over there. Put her over there. Even my husband commented that my daughter seemed unusually happy. One day as my daughter is laughing, I swear I hear a woman's pretty ringing laughter as well. Now that did get my attention. Is there someone in the house playing with my daughter, I wonder? Now I am concerned. My protective maternal instincts rev up a notch or two. I was having a bad day. My whole body throbbed and ached. Everything was groaning, like an old shipping vessel that had seen better days. Yet despite my tired, very throbbing, aching legs and cumbersome swollen feet, I quickly dart up the long sweeping ornate staircase to my daughter's bedroom. I put my ear to the door and I listen in. My heart is fluttering. I'm sure I heard a woman's voice again. I'm sure I'm not mistaken.
Molly is going to have some tea. Would you like some too, Mrs. Pendlebrook? I've got the kettle on, and I make the best tea in Portland. You can have whatever flavour you like. I've got butterscotch, I've got candy floss. What would you like?
I swear I hear a woman's voice saying, "Butterscotch, please. That would be very nice." I quickly, very urgently pushed the door wide open. Did I really hear a woman's voice? Surely not. This is another effect of my pregnancy brain. It's another side effect. It has to be. What else could it be? Sophie is sitting on the floor with two of her dolls sitting up. Their four child's bright pink plastic miniature teacups and saucers arranged across the floor. A miniature kettle, plates, fake plastic cakes that have been placed onto the plastic plates. Sophie looks up at me excitedly.
Are you coming to tea, Mum? Would you like some bubblegum tea?
No, thank you, sweetheart, I say. Who's that you're talking to, sweetheart? I say, glancing around her bedroom. But beyond the open window, inviting in a cool breeze, so that the curtains dance backwards and forwards, there is nothing there but the pronounced smell of violets filling the air, and it smells stronger here than anywhere else in the house.
Mrs. Pendlebrook, says my daughter, she's come for tea as well today. She wants butterscotch. She doesn't know what candy floss is. Everyone else knows what candy floss is, don't they, Mum? I told her it's pink fluff on a stick that you eat at the circus. She says the circus of Pepperin has no candy floss. Can you imagine, Mummy, a circus with no candy floss?
Who's Mrs. Pendlebrook? I asked my daughter.
She's over there. Can't you see her?
Says my daughter, standing next to the cupboard.
Can't you see her, Mummy? She's smiling at you. She's my friend. She always plays with me.
Darling, there's nobody there. It's your imagination. You're making her up in your mind, dear.
No, I'm not, says my daughter, looking annoyed. Mrs. Pendlebrook owned the first house here before it was knocked down, but the house was built all over again. She said you did it very well. She says it better than it was before.
My daughter's startling revelations get my attention. I mean, as far as I know, me and my husband had never mentioned to our 4-year-old daughter that the original house had been knocked down and replaced. How could she possibly know that? I've changed my mind, sweetheart, I say, getting down onto the floor next to her. I think I'll have some of that tea you were offering me. I decide I need to find out more about this Mrs. Penbrook. Even though I can't see anyone in the room with us, I don't feel as if we're alone. The smell of violets is very prominent, and I feel as if somebody is watching me. I tell you what, sweetheart, how about you pour me a lovely cup of candy floss tea? I say to my daughter.
Did you hear that, Mrs. Penbrook? My mum wants candy floss tea.
I lift up the plastic cup to my mouth and say, this is very tasty tea, Sophie. Now tell me, Sophie, why don't you ask Mrs. Penbrook why she's here with us in the house?
She says she's looking after you and me. She says she's protecting us from the big bad man. She wants you to have a safe pregnancy. She says she's going to look after you and she's going to look after me.
Bad man? Who is this bad man? I ask.
Mrs. Penbrook says he worked with the horses. She said he killed her. buried her under the old oak tree. She says he's still there, that he still wants to hurt you, but she won't let him. She won't let him.
I am so confounded by my daughter's extraordinary revelations that I decide to do some personal investigation all of my own. I discover that in the 1800s there's a report in the Evening Democrat newspaper referring to a missing woman called Constance Penbrook, who had vanished from her home without a trace. I discover that Mr. and Mrs. Penbrook had lived in our original farmhouse on our land. She had birthed 8 children here, 2 that had died during childbirth. It was tough in those days, I imagine. Many women died during the throes of childbirth, from conditions like postpartum sepsis, puerperal fever, hemorrhage, eclampsia, high blood pressure, and even an obstructed labour. Why was Mrs. Penbrook in our house, claiming to be watching over me to keep me safe? Safe from what, I wondered. Of course, I tried to discuss my absurd, outlandish findings with my very cynical, more than a little sceptical husband, but he dismissed everything I suggested out of hand. He told me I was talking absolute nonsense, and there was no such thing as ghosts, that my daughter was just playing with an imaginary friend, as girls her age often had imaginary friends. But I knew different. I knew Mrs. Penbrook was real. Let's just say after the idiosyncratic, enigmatic event that had occurred at my daughter's make-believe Dolly's tea party, where I'd been privy to enjoying a fictitious cup of candy floss tea, and been somewhat introduced to an invisible entity that I couldn't actually see, but could certainly sense and smell, as Mrs. Penbrook herself smelt very strongly of lilacs. Let's just say I was on high alert in my home, watching out for any signs of paranormal activity. My efforts were often rewarded by the sound of a female flowery enervated laughter that could be heard bounding up and down the corridors, floating on the upper landing, and of course serenading Sophie in her bedroom. The sound was most commonly accompanied by my daughter's appreciative giggles and happy commentary.
Oh, Mrs. Penbrook, you're the best! You're the best, Mrs. Penbrook!
Indeed, the sound almost became as commonplace and natural as hearing the kettle boil as it clicked off at the electric socket in the kitchen, or the sound of a low-flying aircraft humming over the roof of our home. I felt almost as if Mrs. Penbrook was watching over my daughter for me, keeping her highly entertained. Let's just say Sophie was a handful at the best of times, and as delightful as she was, she could exhaust you. She had an insatiable energy that was not easily satisfied or subdued. I would occasionally hear a woman's very elegant feet padding up and down the staircase, and even a rubber ball would bounce from the landing down the steps to the ground floor, all on its own. And there were a few isolated occasions when I'd been through a tough, tumultuous day, where I would find a rose often parked on my pillow. It really gave me a sense that this woman, Mrs. Penbrook, really had my back, and was taking good care of me. One day I was standing in front of my mirror, examining the full damage of my pregnancy, in a moment of brazen courage, while wearing my undergarments. I remember groaning out loud, "Oh my God, you look like a great big hippo that's expecting triplets, hardly just one baby." And then I saw a woman standing there staring at me in the mirror, and I did a double take. She looked exactly like me, only wearing a Victorian dress, a silvery blue fabric with a floral impression. She was smiling at me broadly, and then she was gone like a flash of light. But I know I had seen her. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. I amble over to my dressing table and begin to experiment with various different hairstyles with my long dark hair, piling it on top of my head, in a similar hairstyle to the ghostly woman that I'd seen in the mirror. And when I stare back at my own reflection, I almost do a double take. I look identical to Mrs. Penbrook. How is that even possible? The resemblance between the two of us is strikingly uncanny. We could quite literally almost be identical twins. 2 nights later I'm lying in a careful position, under my goose-down duvet, my head propped up against a few comfortable pillows. It must have been about 1 o'clock in the morning. The room suddenly becomes freezing cold, so cold that my own breath produces a vapour. Moments later, a cruel, gnarled, arthritic hand thrusts me down on my back, punching an intense pressure upon my chest. Thick fingers, icy cold, burn and sear into my skin. They're calloused. They wrap themselves around my neck and squeeze tightly, very tightly. I can barely breathe. I'm fighting and struggling for breath. Terror consumes my entire body. It pulsates through every vein. Its crippling effects only serve to incapacitate me all the more. I want to scream. I really do, but I just can't. It's like nothing emerges from the back of my throat, as if my throat has dried up like an old prune and is no longer operational. I feel almost as if my entire body is paralysed like a mouse, immobilised by a snake, exposed to its deadly fate, unable to fight back. It's that helpless, overwhelming, defeated feeling, of which I know I'm at the mercy of this malevolent entity, whom of course possesses no mercy. The strong scent of leather tack, hay and horse manure seizes my nostrils, along with a faint hint of whiskey. I open my eyes. I had kept them tightly shut. I was terribly afraid of what my eyes would see, but I see nothing. I oscillate my arms vigorously, like a frenzied, desperate octopus dangling precariously on the end of a fisherman's spear. I try to wrestle with this powerful, invisible entity. I try to push him off with swift, jerky movements. I observe this billowing, dense, dark, smoky form hovering above my body. It's demoniacal, hostile in its frequency. Then in a second I see this grotesque man's face emerge through the smoke, with eyes glowering at me, bright yellow eyes like an angry cat, that stare down at me with a vindictive hatred that is so palpable I can actually feel it. I can taste its bitterness, smell its repugnance. The man has a bodeful, gargoyle-like face that is so threateningly menacing. In that second I know this entity wants to kill me. He desires me to be dead. I can hear a hideous witch-like cackle emerging from the back of his throat. Then suddenly something snaps inside of me, as if the tightrope wound around my vocal cords has finally snapped. My mouth relaxes into a full-bodied scream. I scream, scream and scream. The bedside light switches on. My husband is shaking me. "Calm down," he says, trying to still down my frantic, wiggling body that is still fighting this invisible entity back. But it's gone. So I find myself slapping my husband. He holds my hands tightly together and tells me to calm down. "Calm down, calm down. You've just had a very bad dream." His face looks overwrought and panicky. Has he sensed the entity too, I wonder? But if he does, he doesn't acknowledge anything, only says, "What's wrong? Was it a terribly bad dream? You were screaming very badly, lashing out at me. Are you sure you're all right?" "Oh, don't worry about me. I'm fine. Like you said, it was just a bad dream, that's all." I really didn't want to tell my husband about the demoniacal character that had exerted a forceful pressure upon my chest, that had tried to kill and strangle me. I knew telling my husband this would seem ludicrously bizarre. It wasn't a good idea. Maybe he'd think my pregnancy brain had turned to mush and was subjecting me to all manner of hallucinations. He had been commenting more recently on how clumsy and uncoordinated I had become of late, breaking everything I touched and forgetting things all the time. I would think such allegations, if I heard them from my husband myself, were preposterous. So the last thing I wanted to do was to invite my husband's scepticism and disbelief. I don't want his doubts to cloud my judgment, to make me disbelieve what I've seen, or to escalate an argument between the two of us, whereupon my husband would naturally insist it had all been just a bad dream. It was better to keep the peace, to say nothing at all. I knew what I'd encountered was real, and that's what mattered. I don't know how I managed to fall asleep that night, but against all the odds I do. And that is when Mrs. Pembroke herself enters my dreams, with a reassuring voice. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. It won't happen again, I promise." I hear her whisper this into my mind. I'm not sure that my dream is wishful thinking on my part, but the unfeigned dream was as vividly lucid and as authentically sincere as when I'd seen the ghostly figure of the woman that reminded me of myself, staring back at me through the mirror. I know what happened to me was no fabrication. The following morning the bitter truth is cruelly affirmed when I examine the horrifying trail of black fingerprints around my neck that depict the very distinct finger marks of a man. I'm so startled to see the poignant evidence staring at me blazingly in the face. I run my hands across my neck, knowing full well that everything that happened last night was definitely not in my imagination. But I choose to conceal the evidence from my husband. I've never kept secrets from him before, but I'm too exhausted during this pregnancy, too fatigued all the time, that invoking an argument of any kind is the last thing I need. I just don't have the energy for discord in my home. Besides, I know my husband would become very distressed and discomposed if he saw the black finger marks around my neck. I'm not sure he'd know what to make of them. I would sooner bite the bullet to keep the peace than say something to fuel a debate. My best friend Anastasia, for example, is married to a man who does not possess the same political allegiances as she does. They both support different political parties, and they somehow manage to make their relationship work by biting their lips and restraining themselves from challenging each other in politics. My friend describes her husband as fast asleep, and her husband describes her as a conspiracy theorist who is seeing things that aren't actually there. Personally, I'm heartily glad that when it comes to politics, me and my husband are on exactly the same page, as quite frankly it's easier to live in a house where peace reigns supreme, without unnecessary conflict. Is life not hard enough already? After I return from my visit to the gynecologist, he's exceedingly happy with the progression of my pregnancy, and tells me I'm about to drop, and that in a couple of weeks I will surely give birth. My husband announces to me he's going to be out of the country for a few days, which is not what a heavily pregnant woman wants to hear. But why, I ask? Why can't you wait until after the baby is born? Why now? I'm sorry, sweetheart, says my husband, grabbing me lovingly in his arms and giving me a generous hug. This is a business trip. It can't be avoided. But you need not worry. I will be back in time for the delivery of our baby. I wouldn't miss that for the world. Oh, it's just because I'm a big clumsy klutz, that's all I complain. I waddle around the place like Donald Duck. I've broken so much china and glassware recently. I can't tell you how many times I've held a glass that's literally slipped out of my hand and crashed onto the floor, breaking into thousands of pieces. My husband looks rather concerned. He scratches his head of dark curls reflectively. Why don't you get your sister Doris to stay over here with you while I'm away? I'm sure she would be good company for you. She would help look after Sophie as well, and manage the dinners. No thanks, I say. I love my sister, but in small doses. She has the propensity to be quite bossy, even though she means well. I can just see her ordering me around, telling me what to do the whole time. I don't need that. Very well, as long as you're absolutely sure. On the subject of my daughter Sophie, she was very thrilled about the prospect of becoming a sibling, and also with the upcoming delivery of the baby. She was constantly fondling my stomach and chuckling all the time.
Mrs. Penbrook says you're going to have a baby girl, so I'm going to have a sister. She says you should call it Florence.
This is news to me. I have no idea what sex my baby is, as my husband and I had firmly decided we didn't want to know its sex until it graced us with its presence on the day it was born. Why does Mrs. Penbrook want me to call it Florence? Do you know?
Because that was the name of her first baby that died.
At this revelation, my blood runs cold, as I reflect on my research, and how I discovered the original owner of the house that resided here, Mrs. Penbrook, had indeed had 2 stillbirths. My daughter didn't even know any of this. The following night I retired to bed early. I decided I would read a book, but my eyes became hazy and foggy. I was beginning to yawn. I knew I could barely stay awake. It was late in my pregnancy, so getting to sleep was always a major accomplishment. As any heavily pregnant woman will tell you, sleep can be a tumultuous challenge, as finding that perfect position is never easy. But on this occasion I was so knocked out. I was literally out like a light. It must have been at about 12 o'clock at night that I awoke with a start, almost as if someone had poked me very hard in the back with a forceful finger. My bladder was now stinging with fullness, as the weight of the pregnancy places a heavy pressure on the bladder, So regular visits to the loo go with the territory of carrying a big bump. I knew I needed to go to the loo, and this ablution needed to be attended to at once to avoid an accident. I groaned with frustration. I felt like a really old lady as I manoeuvred what seemed like a cumbersome, uncooperative body to do my bidding. It wasn't exactly very obedient. I was using my elbow to heave my bumbling form up onto the pillow, pushing myself into an upright position, until for a brief moment I was staring around a bleak, tenebrous-looking room. Indeed, it was so dark that all I could distinguish were the cardboard-like black cutouts of our furniture, the stocky upholstered chairs, the delicate chaise lounge, the dresser and the large shelving unit that framed the far wall. I discerned the dark velvety navy blue curtains were billowing against an open window that had invited a refreshing cool breeze to blow into the room, which kicked the curtains against the rails, making a slightly unsettling squeaky noise. A chill ran down my spine, as although I didn't see anything, something didn't feel right about my room tonight. It was then that I smelled the familiar scent of horse manure, hay and leather tack. That was like a red warning siren, blaring through my head like a screaming ambulance, demanding my immediate attention. For a second, my need to attend to my ablutions is postponed. I have to get out of this bedroom as fast as I can. The urgency is all-consuming for me. The last time I smelt that scent, a diabolical, fiendish, satanic-like being had tried to strangle me. It couldn't happen again. It just couldn't. I couldn't go through that again. For a second I see a dark silhouette racing past the underside of my door. It freaks me out. I'm now so filled with terror. I feel as if I'd been punched in the face by a kickboxer thousands of times. My heart is thundering in my chest, booming so hard. I feel every vibration, while my whole body is shaking precariously, my knees trembling, struggling to hold up my entire body weight. It's almost as if I could fold over like a camping chair. I stumble out of my bed in the darkness, bundling towards the sweeping staircase on the edge of the passage, heaving a huge sigh of relief as the passageway is bathed in a soft light. My heart continues to thunder as the smell of the horse manure is getting stronger and stronger. I proceed to heave my oafish body down the stairs, one foot after another. When I'm halfway down the stairs, two firm hands push me over with a heavy jerk, and my whole body jolts and plunges down the staircase, rolling to the bottom, where I land on a Persian rug in a crumpled, bedraggled heap. I am groaning in pain. Oh, oh, oh! Every part of my body is swimming in aches. The pain is unbearably excruciating. There are no words to describe it. It is then that I see this whirling, black, dense smoke, billowing down the staircase, like a black cluster of rapidly moving energy. I know exactly what it is. It's the very same mist that hovered threateningly over my body a short while ago, when that ghostly entity had tried to strangle me. For a fleeting second, the smoke has morphed into a figure of a very cantankerous man, with a deadly expression on his face. I'm convinced this is the evil entity Mrs. Pendlebury has been protecting me and my daughter from. I suspect that this ghostly entity was behind her disappearance in the 1800s, when she vanished off the face of the earth without a trace. The very man my daughter had referred to that buried Mrs. Pendlebury under the old oak tree. All of a sudden I hear a man's voice tickling my ears, as if someone's lips are pressing against them. I hear the hoarse, raspy words of a male voice scream, "Get out, Constance! Get out!" The ghostly entity has called me Constance. I know why, of course, as I had a fleeting glance of Constance Pendlebury once, and she looks exactly like me. So that's why the ghost wants me out. I remind him of Constance. If he killed her, why will he not do the same to me? My whole body is gripped with a dismaying anguish that I am not capable of articulating in words, but it speedily propels me through the house like a NASA space rocket. I couldn't get out of the house fast enough. I vaguely remember running, fumbling urgently with locks, breathing heavily, dashing towards the red barn. I wish I could say in those moments I was thinking about my daughter Sophie, tucked away in her bed, fast asleep. But I was so consumed by my own terror that my survival instincts kicked into gear, and all I could do was race towards that red barn. But even before I got there, a tsunami of water pours down my legs. I know what this is. Bloody hell, my waters have broken. What am I supposed to do now? I can barely call for help, and there is no way I can possibly go back into the house right now. Not when a demonical entity has kicked me out. I'm too afraid to go to my daughter, but in my gut I know she's not in danger. It's me this vindictive being is after. And besides, Mrs. Penbrook has her back. I creep into the barn, grateful for the night light that is always left on in the barn, and although it's very faint and subdued, it's sufficient enough for me to make out the shapes in the barn. I clandestinely crouch behind a couple of old feeder barrels full of oats and molasses, abandoned by the previous owners for some reason. I think I can guess why. All of a sudden I feel my whole body clenching, groaning, heaving. As I go through electric spasms, I feel this burning desire to push. I clutch my stomach tightly. Oh my God! I can't be having my baby! Not prematurely! Not here! That's not possible, is it? I think falling down the staircase has brought on my contractions. But this is a week before my due date. This can't be happening now. I hear a strange banging noise and nearly jump out of my skin. Could that ghostly entity have followed me into the barn? Please, God, no! My heart hammers violently in my chest, but I sigh with relief, almost smiling and laughing to myself, when I realise about over 8 raccoons are stuffing their faces with horse feed. They've spilled out of the barrel for themselves. One raccoon is on top of the barrel and continues to spill more feed onto the floor below for his buddies to retrieve. I hear the creatures chewing hungrily, and then suddenly I see a large silhouette enter the barn. The raccoons immediately scurry away, as fast as they possibly can, sensing a predator is in their midst. I am now crippled by my own physical pain, but also by a personal terror. This thing, whatever it is standing there in the doorway, is terrifying. In the darkness I see a yellow eye shine 8 feet off the ground, and this hefty, stocky shape. What the hell is that? Please no, not another demonical entity, is it? The next thing I know, daggers pound my insides, as if I'm being stabbed 1,000 times over. I let out some agonizing shrieks, and then there he is, standing over me, looking down at me, with a bewildered, nonplussed, rather bemused expression on his face, as if I was the last thing he expected to encounter in the barn. Raccoons, yes. Horse feed, yes. But me, certainly not. The large creature's face catches the light. I realise that this is no demonical entity. It's actually a Bigfoot. But I don't know whether to be relieved or to be dismayed. Before I can react to this nonsensical Bigfoot, he whistles loudly. Another Bigfoot enters the barn. She's female. The two creatures begin to talk to each other in a strange, rather foreign language, which includes lots of clicks. They speak backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. I realise they're discussing me intently. The male nods. He glides away. The female Bigfoot takes over. She's looking down at me. Her treacle-coloured eyes emit a yellow eyeshine. She points at my belly and herself, raising 2 fingers. I think she's telling me she's had 2 babies. She's experienced at giving birth, and she's going to help me. I nod, knowing that this creature is not here to harm me. I can sense she wants to help me. She's showing me how to breathe, by demonstrating long, slow breaths. I follow her lead, and her deep breathing exercises rarely help me. The Bigfoot's bent down on all fours. She cleans an area of the barn, sweeping the dust away on the floor as quickly as she can, with an old cloth she finds lying over a large bucket of white enamel paint that appears to have dried up. She cradles me up in her arms, as if I'm as light as a toy poodle, and places me gently onto the cleared spot. Every time I groan and wince in pain, cowering under its attack, she talks to me in an encouraging voice. It sounds so poetic. I look into her beautiful eyes. They are warm and kind. She offers me her hand to squeeze every time I'm in the grips of agonizing pain, and when I squeeze tightly, she doesn't even flinch at all. I can't say I'm really surprised. She's huge. I'd say she's easily over 7 foot tall, 600 pounds, finely covered with long silky hair that smells like a flowery meadow. Her head is slung low on a pair of humongous shoulders. I'm struck by how human her face is, and how terribly concerned she is about me. There is no doubt she really cares about my welfare. As strange as this may sound, I feel as if I'm in the safest, most experienced hands that know exactly what they're doing, and I have nothing to worry about, so calm descends over me, like a cooling wave. This Bigfoot female has given birth in the wild before. Without the intervention or help of doctors, nurses, or midwives, she's going to help me through all this. I haven't got a choice in the matter anyway. My baby is coming out. The luxury of choice has been expunged from me. The Bigfoot pulls my nightdress above my legs and is inspecting between them, becoming incredibly excited, indicating that she can see the head, and with her hands that I need to push still more. Finally, with further pushes, out comes my baby. It just slides out of my legs, and the Bigfoot pats the baby's back. We're rewarded with a loud cry. She wipes the baby clean of its blood with her long fur and hands it back to me. Then she attends to the umbilical cord. And once the baby is born, 40 minutes later or so, the placenta finally comes out. And the Bigfoot is asking me if she can have the placenta. And I giggle and nod, realizing that she actually wants to eat it. The Bigfoot whistles, and the big male appears. Both of them take turns in holding my baby, bobbing it up and down in their overlong arms, like proud parents. They are so excited about my baby. They are thrilled about its birth. I think for both of them, being involved in my daughter's birth has brought us together as a team, an unlikely team, and there is a connection birthed between the three of us, along with my baby. It's incredibly special. The friendship between us can never ever be severed. They clap me on the back again and again to say well done. And they finally get me to my feet, walking back with me side by side to the house. At the time, my joy of giving birth to the baby is so immense that I forgot about the dark entity that could still be lingering around my property. The Bigfoots continue to clap me on the back, looking into my eyes as if I'm some kind of unheralded hero. They cuddle my baby again and again. They love my baby. The female Bigfoot reads my mind. I hear her whisper into my subconscious, "Dark energy, it's gone. Safe now." I feel reassured that it's safe to re-enter my property. But how was she able to speak to the depths of my mind? It's incredulous, but tonight has been so full of surprises. How can I be shocked by anything ever again? I watch them gliding away, talking excitedly to each other non-stop, backwards and forwards. No surprises for guessing what they're talking about. They speak with an effervescent ebullience. Much like me, this is a night they're unlikely to ever forget, as long as they live. When I return to the house, the energy is definitely benign, warm and loving. I feel safe to re-enter. I attend to my baby's needs, and then to Sophie, and then finally I fall fast asleep, after an exhausting night. Of course, after a check-up at the hospital the following day, I waste no time in informing my husband that I've given birth to our baby girl, at home, omitting the horrifying details that I gave birth on a less than pristine barn floor, layered with fine silvery silken cobwebs, fine dust, and a scattering of grain, with the help of a female Bigfoot. I'm not exactly sure how he'd have taken that revelation, so I decide to spare him the details. Besides, would he really believe that a female Bigfoot helped me deliver my own baby? I'm not sure if the boot were on the other foot, I would actually believe him, as in truth Bigfoot's existing here in North America was not something I felt even was a genuine possibility. But I stand now corrected. My husband's voice on the end of the phone sounds more than a little ruffled. "You gave birth at home, all on your own? I don't understand. Why on earth didn't you call the emergency services? Are they that unreliable?" "It was too late for all that. The baby slipped out."
"Well, why didn't you call them after the baby was born? Surely you needed their help."
"I was tired."
"You managed to cut the umbilical cord on your own and deliver the placenta?"
"Yes, everything."
"I'm sorry, sweetheart. It must have been terrifying giving birth all on your own without me. I don't understand how you had the baby premature. It wasn't due for another week yet. I feel I've let you down. You must have felt awfully alone." I smiled to myself, as I know I was far from alone. That female Bigfoot was the best nurse I've ever had. The next morning I watch a large Range Rover parking outside my property. A petite woman climbs out of her car and stares up at the house for a long while, taking it all in, as if she's soaking up the energy of the house. To my amazement, she's waving up at the upstairs window of my house, as if seeing someone she knows, but no one is there. My daughter is with her nursery group, so she's certainly not waving to Sophie. Could she be waving at Mrs. Penbrook? It would seem so. I can discern the click-clock sound of her shoes trotting to our front door. I open the door. A blonde woman is standing there, with short bobbed hair that gracefully licks her shoulders, complemented by a neat square fringe that covers her forehead like a silken curtain. I discern she has a heart-shaped face and pretty bear-like brown eyes. She's slender and petite, with a graceful gait, rather like that of a ballet dancer, making me conspicuously aware of how large I am. I do hate it when other people around me make me feel like a beluga whale in their group. She was not what I was expecting to see. I'm not sure what a psychic is supposed to look like. I thought she might be dappled with some new age tendencies, like spiked hair and stuff like that. But this woman looks amazingly normal. "Thank you for coming," I say. "I really appreciate it." She nods at me, smiling at me warmly. "Don't tell me a thing," she insists. "I'm going to have a walk around your property, and then I'll tell you what I'm picking up." "Righty-o," I say. "I'll leave you to your own devices and prepare us some tea." "That sounds great," she says. "I like mine white with 2 sugars, please." I'm bustling around the kitchen preparing tea. I can hear the clunk of floorboards as she walks through different rooms, hovering over them for a moment, standing still, soaking in the energy. Then I hear her gliding down the sweeping staircase until her blonde hair breezes and bobs around the kitchen door. She smiles in at me. "May I sit down?" she asks. "Be my guests," I say, handing her a hot mug of white tea. "You live in a very beautiful house," she tells me. I pick up a very protective female energy that is very nurturing. Actually, she's a woman. I saw her earlier, waving at me from the upstairs window. She tells me she watches over you and your daughter, but that's because she's also related to you by blood, from way down the family line. She says the 2 of you look so alike, you could actually be mistaken for twins. I'm picking up the first name Constance and the second name Pemblebury. She tells me she was murdered in this farmhouse. Apparently there was a farmhand who worked on the premises, a man called Sidney Branning, who didn't take kindly to being ordered around by women. In those days they could get funny about stuff like that. She told me she was married to a loving husband, who left the managing of the horses in her charge, which was unusual in those days. I mean, it was the 1800s, and women were, let's just say, expected to be the demure sex. Constance tells me he was a lazy farmhand. She gave him his marching orders, sacked him, telling him he was no longer welcome on the farm. He was exceedingly affronted for having been dismissed by a woman, and hell-bent on getting his revenge. So clandestinely he returned one night, when he knew Constance's husband was away, and murdered her by strangling her to death and burying her under the oak tree in your yard. But he concealed the evidence so well that even Constance's husband never noticed the ground had been disturbed. Constance has already crossed over to the light, so she's not trapped here, but she watches over the house all the time, only because of the dark spirit of Sidney Branning hanging over this place. He is obviously a threat to you and your family, especially to you, given you look so like Constance. So he's not a demon, I ask. No, he's not a demon, but his angry, troubled soul has a very dark energy. You see, he's lingered here for many long years. I imagine causing chaos to many of the residents that have stayed in this property before you. I would be very surprised if anyone stays here for very long. The trouble is, he hasn't crossed over to the other side, you see. Once he died, he was terribly afraid to make that leap of faith beyond the veil, as he was so convinced he was going to hell. Constance has tried to help him cross over, but he feels it's trickery on her part, a chance to get her revenge on him. As she wants him to burn in the fiery flames, well, that's what he claims. By all accounts, when you moved into this house, you looked remarkably like Constance in every way.
It was like putting the cat among the pigeons, or adding fuel to the fire. Your presence brought out an incandescent rage in Sidney Branning. You reminded him of his iniquity. We never like to be reminded of our sins. Constance clearly knew you were in danger. She says she's been watching over you and your little daughter. You do have a little girl. Yes, I do. She's 4 years old. I think Constance has been playing with her a lot. Constance was telling me that Sidney tried to strangle you, tried to push you down the stairs, so that you gave birth on your own in the barn. She says you gave birth to a little girl. She sent help for you, although whoever was helping you probably didn't know they'd been sent by her. Does that make any sense to you at all? Yes, it does, I say, nodding to the psychic, realizing that good old Constance had sent the unsuspecting Bigfoots my way, who helped me deliver my baby. Now we need to clear the house of this dark energy. We need to cross Sidney over to the light. So I want you to close your eyes after I light this candle and fill this room with light. And I'm going to persuade Constance to bring him over.
Why would she want anything to do with the man after he murdered her?
Forgiveness, dear. Constance knows that Sidney's a troubled soul and needs help. Once you've crossed over to the other side, you don't bear the grudges like we do on the earth plane. We both close our eyes, filling the room with light. He's very reluctant, says the psychic, but he is coming. I think his father is here to greet him. They're hugging. She opens her eyes. That's easier. Easier than I suspected. Much easier. He's gone with his father. As strange as it sounds, the house felt so much lighter. And even when my husband returned from his business trip abroad to be introduced to his baby daughter, he said to me, "This house feels very light, lighter than ever." To cut a long story short, I've only seen the Bigfoots one more time, when they passed the road, when I was in my truck. I wound down my window, and they chatted away to me nicely. I know they're out there in our wood grove, and there are only occasions where I might smell the fleeting scent of violets on the air. So I guess Constance does look in on us from time to time. But the dark energy of Sidney Branning no longer haunts this place. I did put a memorial stone underneath the oak tree, which reads, "In loving memory of Constance Pemberbury, who will never ever be forgotten." I guess she was grateful, as the very next day my room smelt strongly of lilacs, and there was a pretty rose left for me on my pillow. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Growing up, I was naturally timorous, shy, rather self-effacing, which was ironic. I came from a family who was anything but, especially my mother. Suffice to say, perhaps it was my parents, being so confidently assertive, that made me shrink back into the shadows, like a tortoise retreating to the safe confines of its shell. Let's just say my mother could make my cheeks burn, with some of the outrageous off-the-cuff things she would say. I think my brother Knox, who was 2 years my junior, had also become a shrinking violet, due to my parents' blatant impertinence. "Why did Mum have to be so embarrassing today?" he would say, even when he was only 7 at the time. My brother had been upset by the way my mother was repetitively challenging his teacher, like asking her why my brother had drawn 2 suns in the sky in his artwork. "Don't you think it means something, Mrs. Rogers?" she had said to Knox's teacher. "Surely you appreciate the hidden messages in children's artwork. It's a reflection of what's going on in their heads." Even skilled psychologists acknowledge this. My son has drawn 2 suns. Now, it's not normal for a child to draw 2 suns. I think it's very symbolic, don't you? It means something, doesn't it? You as a teacher should be able to discern what it means. Children speak through their art, do they not? Look, Mrs. Dean, I'm no psychologist. I wish I was. I'm just a school teacher. I'm sure you understand that. I sincerely doubt it means anything significant, drawing 2 suns. Maybe Knox just likes the sunshine. It's just art. Children express themselves in my classes with paint. It doesn't have to mean anything, does it? If your son wants to draw 2 suns, it's up to him. It doesn't actually mean a thing. "Oh, but you're wrong, Mrs. Rogers," my mother had insisted. "Let's see what my son has to say about this." Before Knox knew what was happening, he was being hauled over by my mother, who was pointing accusingly at the 2 suns he'd just drawn. "Why did you draw 2 suns, Knox?" my mother had asked my brother, in front of the art teacher, who wore a wide-eyed expression on her face that read, I can't believe this is actually happening. I've seen some weird parents in my time, but this woman, she's about as idiosyncratic and as outrageous as you can get. A real interfering busybody who doesn't know what the heck she's talking about. My brother trembled, his little face looking up at the two adults incredulously.
I like the sun, he explained. If there are 2 suns in the sky, then you know it's going to be an even better day.
Mrs. Rogers looked up at my mother and smiled. There you are. There's your answer. I guess that the sun means that your son has a very sunny outlook. My mother's voice sounds triumphant. There you go, Mrs. Rogers. My son did not draw 2 suns for no reason. I think I've made my point very clear. And at that she grabbed my brother's hand and stomped out of the classroom with an air of belligerence. Honestly, my mother said, she's an art teacher. You'd think she'd be a wee bit more perceptive. Let's just say both my parents were well known in our small town, and shyness had never ingratiated itself towards their lives. For if shyness had been an item of clothing, it would have been thrown out and discarded with the dirty bathwater a very long time ago. My mother was known by the residents of our small community as the biggest gossip, with very strong opinions about things, and she wore that claim to fame like a badge of honour on her lapel, as if it was something to be marvelled and valued greatly. My mother considered herself as astute and as sharp as a voucher, for she never missed a beat. She'd notice minuscule details about people that was nothing short of astonishing, and so in that regard she could be likened to an American version of Hercule Poirot, who was female and of course did not speak with a Belgian accent. If you want to know the little details my mother picked up about people, there were too many to count. Like the time she noticed our vicar was no longer holding his wife's hand when he sat down in the congregation, when someone was reading a passage of scripture, something that no one else had perceived in those scant moments. My mother's sharp eyes had picked up the clandestine, reluctant body language between the pastor and his wife, and instantly smelt a rat. She would tell much of the congregation over tea after the service, when everyone gathered around for coffee and cake, that something was seriously off with the vicar's marriage. They're definitely at war with each other, she said defiantly. They're sleeping in separate bedrooms. They haven't spoken to each other for weeks. I assure you they'll be filing for divorce very shortly. Just you wait and see. As you can imagine, many folk in our small town were naturally exceedingly protective over the vicar and his wife, and were outraged at my mother's cursory comments. My mother despised political correctness in every form, and allowed the words to gush forwards from her mouth like a crystal-clear spring. My mother was never rude or mean to people, but she was an open book. Now that's not a nice thing to say, Merrill, people would spout at her indignantly. The pastor and his wife are solid. You're barking up the wrong tree there. And even if you're right, and you picked up some tension between the two of them, and hypothetically, even if they did have a spat, I'm certain they'll make up soon. After all, the vicar is a man of God. He'd never willingly just throw his marriage down the pan like that. I do not exaggerate my mother's efficiency, an unparalleled skill at seeing things others failed to discern, as lo and behold, a short while later, the news hit our town like a bucket of ice-cold water being flung over people's beleaguered faces, when our long-suffering vicar announced to his saddened congregation that he and his wife were getting divorced. It was repetitive incidents like this that made people pay attention to my mother, sit up and notice, and never take what she was saying with just a pinch of salt. Instead, they secretly marvelled at how ingenuously shrewd and sharp-witted she actually was. On one occasion my mother observed someone's 16-year-old daughter was hiding a pregnancy from her own parents. She could see the young girl's reticent body language retreating into the shadows, hiding her bump under loose layers of clothing, but my mother knew she was pregnant before anybody else did. She told the girl's parents, who discovered that indeed their young girl did have a bun in the oven. They hadn't even noticed a thing. They had failed to observe their daughter's furtive behaviour, and the way her wardrobe had changed so significantly. Instead, they assumed she'd just picked up a little weight, and that her strange moods were simply down to a pugnacious teenager being exceedingly difficult. My mother had a long-standing joke with us, and always would tell us that what she didn't know was not worth knowing. It was probably true. If my father had any skeletons in his cupboard, my mother would have dragged them out a long time ago, as my dad pretty much knew that in our household there could be no secrets that were successfully tucked away and buried masterfully like a squirrel's stash of acorns for the winter. Not a chance. My mother would find them out. She would say things to my dad like, "Who were you having lunch with today at work? You were seen at the diner with a rather smart, well-spoken man with grey hair, wearing a pinstriped suit. Who was he? I got the impression he was from out of state. And was your subordinate? Were you showing him the ropes? Is that what it was all about?" My father would roll his eyes in the back of his head, clap his hands, and say, "How the hell did you know that, sweetheart? Yes, I did have lunch today, if you must know. He's managing the main offices of our Atlanta branch. He is my subordinate from out of state, but he's up here to gain some pointers from me. How on earth do you know this?" "I just know," my mother would say, with a bright twinkle in her eyes and a short tap on the edge of her nose. "Let's just say I have my sources." My father shakes his short-cropped head of brown hair and chuckles. He looks at my mother lovingly through his steely grey eyes. "Jolly good thing I'm not having an affair. I'd never hear the end of it. My dirty laundry would be so conspicuous, everyone in town would know all about it, all the grisly details. You know what, sweetheart? You should have been a private detective. You're wasted as a housewife." My mother looked at my father with wide eyes, as if his words had struck a chord with her. She grabbed my dad's arm fiercely. She gave it a tight squeeze. "Philip," she said, "why didn't I think about it before? That's a brilliant idea." "What are you talking about, sweetheart?" says my father. "What did I say?" "Never you mind," says my mother. But my father knew "never you mind" meant I've got a great idea up my sleeve. My brother and my father audibly groaned. We all knew my mother was up to something. Merrill, my mother. I will admit that I'm known as the town busybody, or gossip, although some have likened me to Hercule Poirot, the Belgian detective. The latter is a compliment I don't take lightly. As for being classified as a gossip, I'm not offended by this either. It was never meant to be obnoxious or mean-spirited. Well, I hope it's not anyway. People call me a gossip, as I know things about them. I'm not shy in making these observations known, but I do bridle myself, even suppress what I know, lest I should cause offence, as nothing I willingly say is ever intended to cause hurt. I have grown men coming up to me sometimes, asking me if I think their wife is having an affair. I can look at the woman in question, and in a short space of time give the man a definitive yes or no. It is in the details, the tiny, minuscule, seemingly benign details, that can tell you an awful lot about a person. I have found human behaviour, facial expressions and gestures, are a rich treasure trove of gleaming information, a minefield of revelation, a mirror of insight. For me, it's not difficult to read between the lines. I think reading people is a gift. I acquired this from a very young age. I see things in people others don't. I believe it's called reading body language. It has absolutely nothing to do with being psychic in any way. It is about harnessing your intuition, your gut. It's about being alert to human behaviour. I have a friend, for example, whose daughter was struggling through school, whereas her other two daughters sailed through their grades. I remember my friend was desperately sad, believing her young daughter would never amount to anything in life. I turned around to her and said, "Your failing daughter is going to be the star in your family." Of course, I was absolutely right. It would seem the two sisters have pretty mediocre jobs these days, but the failing kid at school is running a cosmetics empire single-handedly. I think my sleuth-like tendencies were birthed naturally from a very young age. Growing up as a young girl in Chicago, I would spend my days with my mother, who was a stay-at-home housewife in those days. My mother, like the vast majority of her peers, would stay at home to man the fort, to take care of the domestic considerations, like cooking, cleaning and childcare duties. That was what it was like back then in the 50s, and as far as I can recall, no one quibbled, moaned or complained about it at all. It was what we did. Women stayed at home, men went out to work. I don't recall any of the women feeling demeaned about being a housewife. In those days my mother would host the most fabulous tea parties for her friends that would be like something you might see in Downton Abbey, where she would lay out a sumptuous spread of tiny paper-thin, finger-sized cucumber sandwiches, Boston loaf spread with butter, jam and cream scones, chocolate cake, and Victoria sponge oozing with jam and cream. In those days the young women were very well dressed, wearing flowery cotton dresses with miniature belts around their middles, as this was the way the 50s dressed. So gathering around for tea was a social way of catching up with your friends, and believe me, those women could gossip. This social getting together like this was infinitely better than social media sites today. There really is no comparison in my opinion. I remember they would say things like, "You'll never believe what happened the other day," or "Boy, have I got something to tell you that will make your hair curl." I remember I would be sitting there on the floor next to my mother's legs, pretending to be fully absorbed with playing with my doll, but my ears would be on full alert. They were flapping like a pigeon's wings. Good job nobody noticed. I would listen to the conversation, watch the body language of my mother's friends, and let's just say I learnt a whole lot about other people. I would point out details to my mother that would surprise even her.
"Don't you think it's strange, Mummy, that Lydia's wearing a different perfume today?"
My mother had chuckled at me and said, "Why on earth is that strange, dear? You do say some peculiar things sometimes." She had ruffled my curly blonde hair affectionately with her fingers.
"Lydia's allowed to change her perfume, is she not?
Last time I looked, it was a free country we're living in."
"But, Mummy, don't you remember she told you once that she would never ever change her perfume, that the spicy fragrance is her husband's signature favourite?"
Well, dear, maybe she's bored of the fragrance now and was trying something brand new. Possibly someone bought her a gift, so she put it on her pulse points for a change. Personally, I'd hate to always smell the same.
"But you're not Lydia," I pointed out. "What about her wedding band? She wasn't wearing it today, was she?"
My mother grabbed my arm tightly, looked at me intently in the eyes. "You noticed that? She wasn't wearing her wedding band? Are you sure about this? Are you absolutely sure?"
"Of course I'm sure, Mummy. It wasn't on her finger."
"We've got to go to Lydia's now," my mother had said, grabbing me by the hand and dashing out of the house as quickly as she could. I remember she drove over to Lydia's house at lightning speed, parking her car in a higgledy-piggledy fashion in her driveway. She dashed to the front door, didn't even bother to knock, but scrambled into Lydia's kitchen like an overexcited dog. Lydia was in the kitchen having coffee when me and my mother burst through the doorway, giving the poor woman the shock of her life. Believe me, she nearly jumped out of her skin. Her eyes were as round as saucers. "What you doing here, Emma? You scared the living daylights out of me. Next time you might just consider knocking, will you?" My mother ignored Lydia's sarcastic comments and went straight for the jugular, determined to get some answers. "Lydia, what's going on? Why have you changed your perfume? Why are you not wearing your wedding band? What's going on with you and Frank? Is there something you're not telling me?" Lydia had burst into tears, while my mother had held her in her arms and rocked her like a baby. "Why didn't you say anything at the tea party? Why did you keep so quiet? We're your friends. You know you can talk to us." "I couldn't," says Lydia, choking back the tears. "I just couldn't. I knew I'd break down in front of everyone." Lydia confessed to my mother she was going through a bad patch in her marriage, which was why she had abandoned the fragrance and also the wedding band. "I can't believe you noticed those details," she told my mother. "I'm so touched. You really are a good friend. You don't expect your friends to notice you're not wearing your wedding band." "It's not me that noticed, Lydia. It was Merrill. She's a sharp one, that daughter of mine." "I'm so scared that Frank is going to leave me," Lydia bursts out. "Why would he do that?" asks my mother, staring at Lydia in horror. "You and Frank are as thick as thieves. If the two of you can't sort out your differences, there's not much hope for the rest of us. You're the one with the marriage that most aspired to. What on earth happened?" "He asked me if I had any change in my purse. I told him to go and help himself. That's when he discovered a business card with a man's telephone number on it, saying call me. Let's have coffee sometime.
I'd been meaning to throw the card away. Of course I had. I wasn't interested in this stranger at all. But it was like Frank became so inflamed. He told me I should never have kept the card, that I must have secretly been interested in the man. He was desperately hurt. He refused to even sleep in the same bedroom as me. He told me he couldn't trust me any more.
Is that all? Oh, my word, it is extreme. It sounds like Frank is making a mountain out of a molehill out of nothing. You're an attractive woman, for goodness sake. Surely he knows you might occasionally have a man dishing you out a business card. Why is he so insecure?
That's not the point. Frank thinks it means something that I kept the card. I'm worried he's going to leave me. He's so upset with me. I've never seen him like this before. He stomps into the house like a belligerent bull terrier, virtually growling at me, and then bogs off. Even at such a young age, I remember chuckling.
He's not going to leave you. He's just jealous, but he'll calm down.
My mother and her friend Lydia had stared at me, with nonplussed expressions on their faces. So young, Lydia had piped, but so clever. Of course, I'd been absolutely right. Lydia and Frank resolved their differences, while Lydia made sure she threw out any business cards that were ever given to her by strangers to avoid any discord between her and her husband Frank from ever erupting again, as she had unduly learnt that Frank and the green-eyed monster were very well acquainted with each other. I do remember on one of my mother's tea parties, which on this occasion was actually a book club, where her friends would agree to meet to discuss the book they were reading. On this occasion they were discussing Daphne du Maurier's book, Rebecca, that was published, I think, in 1937, or thereabouts. My mother's good friend Gladys arrives at the tea party, looking so dishevelled, with hair all over the place, grass sticking out of her black poodle haircut, as if she's been hijacked by a haystack, or the farmer had accidentally mistaken her for a scarecrow to plonk in the field to scare off his crows. Believe me, looking like that, she could have scared away the birds in a heartbeat. The very sight of her scared the book club, holding them captive to a profound astonishment. I mean, there was mud spread across her pale skin, like splashes of a clay face mask, along with a plethora of scratches all over her face and body, that looked like she'd become personally acquainted with a bush of thorny briars, or had an unfortunate altercation with a less than domesticated household tabby. There was grazing on her knees, as if she'd taken a fortuitous tumble, an open bleeding scab, along with a plethora of bruises and scratches everywhere you looked on her. Worse still, her once pretty dress was drenched in mud, covered in burrs and briars, bespeckled with droplets of blood, shredded badly, in all its parts, snagged by thorns. It was like her dress was almost as battered as she was. It had taken a serious punnelling, as if it had been worn away in an aggressive tumble-dryer. It was hanging around her in limp shreds and rags, resembling crepe paper, barely covering her legs at all. You could almost see her knickers beneath. If you had known Gladys like we did at the time, you would have known she would never have been seen dead, looking the way she did on this occasion. Something really bad must have transpired for her to overlook her appearance like this, and rock up at our front door, looking exactly like something the cat dragged in. Gladys had always taken so much pride in her appearance, was always meticulously turned out, very well presented. She was the kind of proud woman who never had a hair out of place. Her ruby lipstick looked like it had been painted on her lips by Michelangelo himself. She was such a punctilious, well-groomed person. I'd been to her house once and deliberately run my hands over everything. Surely I would find a speck of dust, I thought, somewhere, or even a cobweb, perhaps, but not a chance. I would secretly marvel to myself that anyone could be this neat. But Gladys always amazed me. She ran her house seamlessly. Even the books in her bookshelf were placed strategically in a methodical alphabetical order. There was nothing out of place in her home. When my mother opened the door to Gladys, with her dog at her side, I think she was half Yorkshire Terrier and some other fluffy toy breed, but even the dog that was normally as pristine as her owner looked like it had been dragged through the hedge backwards. Worse still, it was covered in mud and smelt pungently vile, so much so I almost wanted to hurl up the contents of my stomach. Had the dog been rolling in cow manure and decomposing flesh, I wondered? My mother stood in the doorway, with me standing by her side. We gawked at poor Gladys, as we'd never seen her look like this before. She was a dishevelled mess. My mother could see Gladys was trying to fight back tears, but her resolve was not strong enough. They trickled down her face as if the floodgates had been opened, but her tears were silent and not accompanied by any sobs. My mother took Gladys lovingly into her arms, patting her reassuringly on her back, leading her into the kitchen. "I could have died," she cried in my mother's arms. "But you didn't, did you?" my mother had said. "You and Bo Peep are safe here now. You've got nothing to worry about. You're among your friends here." There, my mother had said comfortingly. She insisted that Gladys sit back on our breakfast nook. She gave her a tot of brandy. "Drink that," she ordered. "It'll help you with the shock." Gladys had knocked back 3 tots of brandy, which wasn't bad going for someone who's not inclined to drink. The alcohol did seem to calm her down, although she never said a single word. Needless to say, all the ladies in the book club entered the kitchen. They began helping Gladys by fussing around her, cleaning up her grazes, attending to her scratches on her face and body, while removing the grass from her hair. Everyone was asking what happened, but Gladys didn't answer any of the questions. For a while it was as if the cat had got her tongue, or maybe she just did not want to talk. My mother said that the latter was probably true, as shock can literally hijack your voice box as you try to come to terms with what transpired, so it suppresses your desire to talk. My mother ran Gladys a hot bath and told her to have a long soak, while she washed little Bo Peep, whom also appeared to be filthy. His breath stank of death and decay, and of decomposing, rotting vegetables. The smell was obnoxiously offensive. My mother found a spare toothbrush and paste, and attempted to brush his teeth, to get rid of the atrocious smell. To date I have never smelt a breath so repugnant. Finally Gladys looked halfway human again, apart from the scratches and bruising on her face, but she looked a lot cleaner. She joined the rest of the group, wearing one of my mother's fresh cotton smocks, covered in pretty yellow sunflowers, with a matching thin yellow belt. My mother had brushed her hair until it gleamed, given her a touch of lipstick. With her now clean dog by her side, wearing a yellow ribbon in his hair, with a breath that smelt strongly of mint, people began to relax, drinking tea and eating cake, choosing not to cross-examine Gladys, as they sensed that she was not eager to talk. But halfway through the tea, Gladys broke the silence. She randomly spouted, "I had a nasty fall. I fell into a hedge of thorns." "What happened, Gladys?" everyone chorused together, sensing that now she was willing to talk. Gladys nibbled at an egg sandwich and said, "The trouble is, if I tell you what happened, I'm not sure you're going to actually believe me. If I was wearing your shoes, I wouldn't. But hands on heart, it is the absolute truth." "You know us, Gladys. You can tell us anything. We know you don't lie. Out with it, girl." Gladys glanced around at each and every one of us. She seemed reassured by her attentive audience, with their unmasked, earnest expressions. She spoke at first with a measure of hesitancy and reluctance. Then, as she grew more audaciously confident, like a horse in an exercise ring that has suddenly found its bearings, she gallops along with her story, and every eye in that room was fixed on her. No one batted an eyelid, flicked an eyelash, twitched a finger, wiggled a spoon, or chewed a morsel. Ears were alert to her every word. "Well, I got up early this morning to take Bo Peep for her morning walk. I always do that. I left our farmhouse, trundled down the long white dirt road outside our property, and took the left-hand turning to the red maple wood grove. You know, the one that Farmer Matt lets everyone use to walk their dogs." Everyone nods. "One of the best wood groves, without a doubt," my mother confesses. "Our dogs love it there." Well, it was such a beautiful, sparkling morning. Bo Peep was running off her lead. She was sniffing everything like she always does. There isn't a single area in the woodgrove that has not been marked by her scent, I'm afraid. Bo Peep lacks modesty. She has no shame. She anoints everything with her golden showers, as if baptizing the entire forest. The ethereal light this morning that was dancing through the canopy, it was so pretty. The pathway resplendently dappled with the golden glaze of recently fallen leaves. It looked magical, beguiling, as if we were walking down a path made of gold. The wind blew up many of those autumn leaves from the oak trees,
that were flying in the air like golden confetti, while the boughs of the trees were swaying up and down, as though the trees themselves were dancing. I was feeling blissfully happy, very, very contented, thinking about all the points I wanted to raise about Daphne du Maurier's book Rebecca, which I've been thoroughly enjoying reading. In a trice, Bo Peep, who usually only runs a few feet ahead of me, as she's a well-behaved, good-natured dog, begins to behave paradoxically. She seems capricious, rebelliously incompliant. Her tail is wagging at 1,000 miles an hour. She obstinately bolts into the woods with a bull-headed determination and obstreperous disobedience, so that she's nowhere to be found or seen. I begin to panic. Anxiety courses through my veins, as Bo Peep has never ever behaved so incongruously before. Never just run off like this so wilfully and abandoned me like this. I call after her, then I catch sight of her running towards me, with something in her mouth, that she's holding on to for dear life. I knew it was another unmentionable. I regret to confess that Bo Peep has a ghastly unfavourable habit of picking up dead carcasses, most usually of birds, mice and rabbit, all the time. It's a major deal for me to extract them from her mouth. She clamps down on her dead packages with a disobliging jaw, like a pugnacious crocodile. She growls at me roguishly like a Rottweiler dog, so assertively that I'm almost sure she'll bite me. Of course she never does, but she puts up a convincing show nevertheless. Somehow I always manage to get out the thing from her jaw, by using the edge of a stick. This time the thing that fell out of her mouth was 3 human fingers attached together. There was a long, drawn-out silence among my mother's friends. You could have almost heard a pin drop, as everyone tried to assimilate what Gladys was actually telling them. There were mixed reactions and gasps from my mother's friends, who were gulping down this revelation with difficulty, like trying to swallow a ping-pong ball, with little success. "Bloody hell! Your dog had 3 fingers in her mouth! Human fingers! Are you being serious?" "That's right," says Gladys. "At first I thought the fingers weren't real. It seemed too far-fetched that they could be. But after I poked them with the stick, I knew they were real. The nail bed had been badly gnawed, as if the owner of those fingers was a nervous person, and bit their nails. I was freaking out on seeing these fingers, but I didn't scream as you might expect. My heart just thundered in my chest, as I knew that if my dog had found 3 fingers, there had to be a corpse lying there in the forest. I knew I was going to have to turn around and retreat, going to the police station to tell them what I'd uncovered. But let's just say Bo Peep was not an obliging participant in this enigmatic discovery. She had other ideas, better ideas, and despite my best efforts to get her to heel, she wilfully ignored me all over again, and dashed back into the woodgrove, with me following behind her, calling her name. But would she listen? Not a chance. That's when I see my Bo Peep. She's filthy, caked in mud, scrambling through mud under this hedgerow, making the strange noise that emanates from the back of her throat. She's pawing and digging at the ground, and I can only imagine what must be decomposing human remains. "Bo Peep, stop that right now!" I cry out. "Stop that, Bo Peep, now!" But of course my dog is uncooperative today. She's rascally excited about what is lurking beneath that bush. I don't have to be a rocket scientist to guess what it is. It is the undeniable smell and stench of death, decay, and decomposition, which reveals all to me. There is such a putrid odour that's coming from underneath that hedgerow, unlike anything I've ever smelt before. It's vile. I actually run backwards, clasping my hands over my nose and mouth, and then I find myself falling over the edge of this embankment, right into a bramble bush. And when I say into a bramble bush, I mean it quite literally. I land bang in the middle of a bramble bush, which probably saved me from almost certain death, as I could have fallen back on some jagged rocks in the valley below. My hair is encased with needles, my dress and everything, and the more I move my body, the more scratched I become. This time Bo Peep has dashed down the embankment and is barking at me as I'm caught up in the middle of the hedgerow. She barks and barks and barks and barks, and that's when I see her. "Oh, you saw another dog walker," said my mother. "What a relief! You mean Bo Peep alerted the dog walker to your entangled body caught up in a hedge of briars. What a stroke of luck! At least Bo Peep got their attention. No,
This was not a dog walker. This was something else. So human, but not human. I don't know what she was. What do you mean, human but not human? What are you talking about? My mother asks. Gladys hesitates for a moment. Her eyes dart from one of my mother's friends to another, finally to me. This is the part of the story I don't actually expect you to believe. And if you don't believe me, I won't take offence. But I will say this to you, that what I'm telling you now is absolutely 100% true. I'm lying there in the middle of this bush, incarcerated by the thorny briars, trying carefully to untangle my clothes from the thorns. But as I release my clothes from a few jagged, jutting appendages, I get hooked onto still more thorns that are snagging and tearing angrily into my clothes with fierce cutting edges that spare no regard for human flesh. I know I'm in a deep pickle, as releasing myself from this hedgerows is going to be a nightmare of note. Every single part of my body is stinging and burning from the scratches, and the more I try to free myself from this thorny trap, the more I get caught up and ensnared by these angry, vicious, jagged hooks. It's then I see this figure staring down at me. She's humongous. I'd say she's equivalent in size to 4 200-pound men, and I'm not exaggerating either. I know she's female, as she possesses a pair of firm breasts that are small in size. I mean, she's built like a solid concrete building, with shoulders at least 4 feet across. She must have been between 8 to 9 foot tall, about 800 pounds, and covered from head to toe with long flowing dark hair that has an auburn undertone that is terribly pretty. But what was this creature? Asks my mother. I don't know, says Gladys, but the only way I would describe her to you is that she was incredibly human, apart from her great size. She had a pyramid-shaped head, burly proportions, overlong arms, but her face, oh my word, her face was so human. She had these yellow gold eyes, but they were kind. The next thing I know is that she reaches towards me and just pulls me off the hedgerow. Although my dress tears on some of those thorns, she rips me away like a piece of Velcro, throws me over her shoulders like a sack of potatoes, and carries me to the top of the embankment, with Bo Peep following dutifully behind. Then, using her huge hands, she brushes off my thorns and examines some of my scratches, when she's finally placed me on the ground, of course. She speaks to me in a foreign language, a brief scattering of words I don't understand. But I think she's saying to me, "You'll be all right now." She pats me on the back, gives me a kind nod, and just glides away, just like that. I watch her moving. Oh my God, it's like watching someone floating on air. She moves with such grace. Bloody hell, says my mother. That is some story. I wonder what she was. An angel, perhaps. I mean, she came to your rescue, did she not? Everyone is nonplussed by Gladys's account, but they know her too well to doubt her story, as Gladys does not know how to lie or make up fantastical stories. She's not exactly blessed with a vivid imagination. Anyway, later that day, the police were dutifully informed about the 3 fingers that Bo Peep had retrieved from the woodgrove, the putrid smell from under the bush, where Bo Peep had been digging. It would seem that the police discovered the remains of a local man who had gone missing in the area. It was discovered he'd been shot with a hunting rifle. Later, a man came forward, admitting that his friend had confessed to the killing. He had been hunting and had shot at something he thought was a deer, only to discover to his horror that he'd killed a man. In a blind panic, he'd fled the scene. It was a relief for the family to be able to grieve their lost loved one and have a burial for him. The hunter was charged with involuntary manslaughter and ordered to do some community service. So with a good lawyer, he did get off scot-free. So perhaps you can see why some of my mother's tea parties back in the good old days of the early 50s was infinitely more interesting than playing with my dolls. I really decided that I loved listening to adults, as they always talked about fascinating things. I pondered for a long time about the red maple woodgrove that was ironically filled more with oak trees than maples, where Gladys had encountered that strange hairy humanoid, as the subject aroused in me a great sense of intrigue. I think I was born with inquisitive as my second name. Even my mother realized from a very young age that I preferred hanging around with adults, which was why growing up I never had any kiddie friends of my own, and was very alert
to the idiosyncrasies of adult behaviour, from which I gained so much insight. Going back to the beginning of my story, which might just be a good place to start, I knew my husband's words had struck a chord with me. "You're wasted as a housewife, you are. You should have been a private detective." He was absolutely right. Never was a truer word ever spoken that had rolled so seamlessly off my husband's tongue. But in the single beat of a heart, his poignant words had changed my life. What if I could put my talent for observation to better use, I thought. I was not a professional private detective, but I was naturally astute. I might be able to help people out. So I wrote a note on a piece of blue cardboard, which read the following. "Are you looking for answers? Perhaps you suspect your spouse is cheating on you. I will uncover the truth at a very small price. Please call Merrill on 3342-562. I had asked the butcher, the baker and the greengrocer if I might put my note on their window. Suffice to say they'd been rather amused when they read the note that I'd pinned proudly onto the interior glass pane. "Be my guest, Merrill," they would chuckle. "Good on you, girl, and good luck. Not that you're going to need it, of course. Let's just say, Merrill, anyone who hires your services is not going to be remotely disappointed. You'll get them answers, all right. I just pity the person that is caught out for their mischief, as you will leave no stone unturned, I'm sure. And let's just say their dirty laundry will become very conspicuous." At the time I was living in a cute little historic town called Pinville with my husband and my 2 boys, Hamish 12, Knox 10, whom, unlike me and my husband, were rather self-effacing children growing up. I often thought I embarrassed my kids by being so out there in people's faces, so effusive, so chatty, so garrulous, so quick to notice things that others easily overlooked, like the very fact that Knox's teacher was wearing a new shade of lipstick and had a positive glow to her skin. "Your teacher's got a new boyfriend, Knox," I told him. He responded, "Keep your bat out of my teacher's business, Mum. Don't start gossiping about her, will you please? Don't tell everyone in town what you know." My kids hated my articulate perception, my powers of discernment, which caused them to burrow in their shyness like a rabbit charging for cover to the safe confines and insulated security of its warren. They would squirm with self-consciousness and unabashedly demand me to stop humiliating them and putting my nose into everyone's business. I know they were right, of course, but I couldn't help myself if I just noticed things. Our beguiling whitewashed farmhouse, with its generous French windows, looked like a gleaming pearl nestled in the viridescent splendour of the southwestern Kentucky mountains in Bell County, on a small plot of land that gave you the distinct impression it wasn't so small at all, as the surrounding landscape snuggled itself cosily around our home like a large effusive hug that seemed to magnanimously stretch out for an eternity. The lavish views were not for the faint-hearted, for the arresting mountains thrust their powerful sturdy contours into the sky with a cocky self-assurance and pride, like solid, dependable, steadfast friends that remained stoically composed come rain or shine, and smiled in your daily morning lens when you arose every morning from a good night's sleep, to be greeted by the same reassuring views day after day that comfortably reminded you that this was home. These proud, familiar landmarks are always accompanied by a plethora of indigenous trees, namely red maples, red and white oaks, yellow polos, serviceberries, only adding a rich resplendence to the countryside by splashing their vibrant colours across the vast expanse of flowery meadows and fields, giving spectacular showings in autumn, thereby assuming a leading role in ensuring the Kentucky landscape is all but an artist's dream. I remember the day Elaine Kenray came to see me. I'd seen her around town before, shopping at the grocer's, buying bread at the baker's, but one thing I discerned about her was she avoided people like the plague, sometimes responding to their friendly hellos on the sidewalk by giving them a polite, nonchalant nod. The day she drove down my long, precipitous driveway, bespeckled with dozens of rocks and pebbles, no one was more surprised to see this unassuming woman than me. I could see her parking her car into the neat slot next to mine, then sitting there in the front seat, possibly working up the courage to do what she came to do. I was hanging my washing up on the line that morning, and I could sense the woman's reluctant hesitancy. The fresh scent of lavender washing powder infused the air as I hung up my family's washing, under the soft haze of warm sunshine. All the while, my eyes remained pinned on the woman. I had seen Elaine in attendance at church several times, sitting next to her husband, but she was one of those demure, rather reserved people that kept herself to herself and didn't actively engage with people in our small town. Some said she was a cosmopolitan Philadelphia city girl who looked down on the country folk with an inverted snobbery and had a high, inflated opinion of herself. I certainly did not get that impression of her. On the contrary, I saw her as desperately shy, too afraid to interact with others. She distanced herself from people because of feelings of inadequacy. That was what I got from her. The woman climbs out of her car reluctantly. She's extremely hesitant. I imagine her mind is whispering, "Don't do this," but another more powerful force within her propels her ever forward. She glances up in my direction and watches me hanging the washing on the line. I see her face physically relax, as if seeing me engaged in such a mediocre, mundane activity makes me come across a lot less intimidating and daunting. She walks over towards me, helps me pin up the rest of my washing, without saying a word. She seems grateful to keep her fingers busy. "I saw your advertisement, pinned up in the window at the grocer's. I've heard about you before. Some people describe you as the town Hercule Poirot. I was thrilled when I saw your pin-up because I really could do with your help. And I'm willing to pay well, if you can find some of the answers I'm looking for, to prove that I'm not going completely mad." I look up at the woman and study her curiously. "It's your husband. You want me to find out if he's cheating on you. Is that right?" "That's right," she says, looking surprised and stunned at the same time. "How could you possibly know that?" "Call it a good guess," I say. "Well, if you must know, you have dark circles under the eyes that suggest you haven't been sleeping. You're wearing your cardigan inside out, with the label showing, which suggests your mind is otherwise engaged on more pressing matters. You were hesitant to get out of your car just now, and since we've been talking, you've been biting your lip nervously, furrowing your brow all the time. You look like a woman that wants to know the truth, but doesn't really want to know it, like you'd prefer to run and hide away, and pretend none of this was actually happening. But there's a greater part of you, your higher self perhaps, that refuses to be a mug and wants to find the truth." "Wow, I couldn't have said it better myself. That's exactly how I feel. I want to know if my husband is cheating on me, but I don't. You see, if I pretend nothing is going on, then I can go on living my life as normal, with the benefit of denial as my umbrella of security, wrapping me safely up in a bubble of self-preservation so that nothing can hurt me or offend me. But then lying to myself like this, not facing the truth, is being a coward, is it not? I can't abide the thought of being a coward. My dad was in the military, you know. That man had so much courage. He'd lay down his life for a fellow American in a heartbeat. He would say to me, "I do what I do so that you and your children's children can live in peace." I feel like if my dad could have such guts, how can I be so pathetically fearful of my husband cheating on me? I mean, it happens, doesn't it? Fidelity is not as sacred as it once was. The problem is, when it happens to you, it's so personal. It really, really hurts. I raise my brow. "Well, there you are. My guess is you do know your husband is cheating on you. Most women, even the less intuitive ones, sense these things. A person who's having an affair gives themselves away in a plethora of little things they do, and quirky, peculiar behaviours that can so easily be overlooked or explained. You're right. I know he's having an affair. I know in here," says the woman, pressing her hand on her heart. "It's a gut feeling." "In what way have you discerned that he's cheating on you?" I ask, pinning up a pillowcase on the line, while the woman who insists I call her Elaine hands me a peg. "Well, for a start, he's barely touched me, or even given me a hug these days. And when I ask him why there's no intimacy between us, he tells me he has a headache, or is terribly tired. He claims he's working very hard, but he slips out in the middle of the night. I ask him where he's going. He says he's taking a walk as he can't sleep, and that a walk at night relieves his insomnia. But he drives to his walking destination, which is very suspicious in itself. When I have offered to accompany him on one of his walks, he jumps down my throat and tells me that he needs time to himself. I've seen him packing cold wine and snacks into his trunk, so he's up to something. When he returned from one of his walks, there were strands of hay and moss dangling in his hair. I mean, how does that happen? I found lipstick on his collar once in a coral colour that I would never wear, because it's too soft for me. Of course, when I challenge him and tell him that I know he's cheating on me, he becomes reactive. He tells me it's all in my head. He's making me feel convinced I'm losing my mind, that I'm imagining everything, but I know I'm not. Of course he's denying it, I say. He wants you to believe you are going mad. So I guess what you want me to do is to get the photographic evidence. Is that right? And confront him with it. That's right. I also need to find out who she is, and how she met my husband. If you take photographs for me, the evidence of my husband's infidelity will be clear. He'll also have to agree to a reasonable divorce settlement. I also want to walk away from this marriage with my head held high, knowing I was not the one that was irresponsible and lacking integrity in this relationship. I just need you to know, Elaine, that I'm not a professional sleuth, I tell her. If you prefer, you might want to hire someone who does this for a business. I'm going to lay my cards on the table and admit to you that I believe I am a great sleuth in the making, but I don't have experience, and you're my first case ever. Don't worry about that, Meryl. Your reputation precedes you. I'm quite sure you would outsmart most detectives in a heartbeat. She hands me a photograph of her husband, gives me the address of his workplace, and his car registration number. I am very, very excited. On my first day on the job as a private detective, my heart is flapping in my stomach. I wait with bated trepidation outside Elaine's husband's office at lunchtime, in a car parked on the opposite side of the road. He works at the local bank. I see people gliding in and out of the glass doors, some occasionally talking to each other. I watch a man in his bicycle pedalling down the street, and a woman walking her 2 Boston Terriers and a pug down the sidewalk. A young girl is holding her mother's hand, skipping down the street happily. These mundane daily events come and go. I see no sign of Elaine's husband. My heart almost sinks. I'm parched, longing for a cup of coffee and something to eat. But I know that if I attend to those physical needs, I might just miss Elaine's husband. 11 o'clock rolls through to 12, and then to 1 o'clock, and then finally by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. My bladder is burning with fullness. I'm bursting for the toilet, but I have to hold on for a little longer. It's a gut feeling inside me that clenches my stomach muscles so tightly that they stand up to the disturbance, like a hedgehog's spikes, dutifully obeying my urgent demands to hold on a little more. But something is about to happen. I can feel it and even taste it on my tongue like a snake does. Then seconds before I'm about to give up all my sleuthing, admit defeat, and then return home, all of a sudden Elaine's husband comes dashing out of the bank. He looks around him furtively, his head bobbing to the left and right, like a man about to cross a busy highway. I know he's checking to see if the coast is clear. A young woman is trudging behind him, but I don't see her clearly at this point, as my attention is completely harnessed on him. I study Elaine's husband curiously. He's a good-looking man in his late 30s. He walks with a confident, cocky swagger, as if he's quite infatuated with himself. From first appearances, he looks a little like a narcissistic personality type that has only been in love with himself. He's rather handsome, that's clear, but he knows it and flaunts it with that self-assured, haughty energy. Let's just say a few females giggle as they watch him strolling by. They whisper among themselves, giving him appreciative, approving glances, which make me squirm. Men like him don't need to be encouraged. Those ignorant, naive girls are only fueling this man's intense self-adulation and self-absorption. He clearly loves being the centre of attention. I would say he's 6 foot tall, with an olive-coloured skin and hazel eyes. I notice his dark hair is spiky in the middle, very short on the sides, and he's wearing a very expensive, trendy pinstriped suit, with a flamboyant, loud tie that screams out loudly against the white, crisp cotton of his shirt. I literally crossed the road to the opposite pavement and trundled behind him, keeping a safe distance. The woman who had been walking behind him now moves to his side, as they finally enter the Italian restaurant together. I'm standing behind the woman in the restaurant while waiting to be chaperoned to her table. I notice she's a striking woman of about 5'6", in her early 30s, with shoulder-length auburn hair, blue eyes and a fair skin. She's wearing a business jacket and skirt that are so incredibly tight, they actually fit her like a glove. It's not difficult to perceive these two are way more than just friends, but they act like business associates, but I'm not buying it. I can read between the lines. They're in a public place, so they're acting like work colleagues. "Table for two," says the waitress, picking up 2 leather-bound menus. The couple nods eagerly. She guides them to a private, discreet table in the far corner of the restaurant, which they point to eagerly. So I choose a table, the only one that is directly behind theirs, which I hope is not too obvious, but I'm acting as if I'm waiting for 3 other people to join me, seated at a table for 4. I'm in a conspicuous position, too conspicuous to take any snaps, but close enough to eavesdrop on their conversation. If the restaurant remains pleasingly quiet, that is. "You don't think anyone suspects us," says a woman, looking around the restaurant nervously, her gaze briefly filtering in my direction, but I pretend to be stuck in my book. "No, of course not. As far as anyone else is concerned, we're just having a business meeting together. You're my secretary. I've taken you out to lunch to discuss my weekly itinerary. As long as we don't draw any attention to ourselves, no one will ever suspect a thing." The woman responds, "But I've noticed Colleen at work. She keeps giving me these funny looks every time I go into your office. She's watching me like a hawk all the time." "Ignore her. The woman's just a bitter old jealous hag. She probably wishes she was you." "But I thought you said your wife has recently become suspicious as well. I mean, doesn't she think it's weird that you keep going out at night for a walk and returning home much later?" "Well, how else are we going to spend any quality time together? It's the best excuse I can come up with. Besides, I don't think Elaine is the brightest brick in the block, let's just say. I tell her that work is very stressful and that I need plenty of exercise. I think I fobbed her off very nicely. But if my husband were slipping off at 10 every evening and returning at 12, I'd know something was cooking in the pot." "Well, that's because you're not just a pretty face, are you, sweetheart? You have some active brain cells in that smart little head of yours. But Elaine, she's docile like a lapdog that accepts everything that's thrown at her. That woman has no self-respect whatsoever." "How much longer is this going to go on for? I mean, I don't fancy being the other woman for much longer. When are you going to make an honest woman out of me?" "There's no need to rush things, Sonia. We've got all the time in the world to be together. Besides, you also have to play your part in speaking to your man." Unfortunately, a few more people came into the restaurant and were talking so loudly, laughing and clinking glasses of wine together, that the voices opposite me had been drowned out and washed away by the excitable chitter-chatter of people who were getting very enthralled about the weekend ahead, and had got off work early, it would seem. Regretfully, I could no longer eavesdrop on Elaine's husband's conversation. The couple soon became buried among the tables, that were now filling up with a plethora of people, eager to enjoy a belated lunch. I'd heard enough, though. I could establish that Elaine's husband George was almost certainly having an affair with his secretary, who was a whole lot more interested in him than he was in her, although her ignorance in this regard was rather mind-blowing. She didn't ascertain that she was actually being used as like a fun toy, and that her boss's designs on her were very short-term. I didn't get the impression he really wanted to dump his wife Elaine, although it was clear he had no respect for her. He was the kind of man that would promise women the earth, have an affair with them, groan and moan to them about his wife, and spit out the new lover when he was bored. I'd hasten to say that this was a man who had had many affairs behind his belt, like notches on his bedpost. Furthermore, he was the kind of man that would own a little black book, that would score woman out of 10 who he dated, as that was the extent of his juvenile, immature depravity. I think his secret life beyond his marriage was just a big boost to his ego, as narcissistic it would seem he was. As I watched George and his secretary Sonia that day, chatting away garrulously, even though they made no physical attempt to touch each other, it was profoundly clear that they were very much involved. Suffice to say, given that it was a Friday, veering onto the weekend, I had my suspicions that George might choose to go for one of his evening walks tonight, which would mean I would be on night duty, keeping watch over Elaine's family farmhouse. I knew my husband would be less than enamoured about this prospect, but I needed to get some evidence for Elaine, and taking pictures with a flashlight on my camera was not going to be easy, but it had to be done. "Why on earth are you doing this?" my husband complained. "It's one thing to follow the man around during the day, but at night it's a whole nother story. If they see your camera flashing, they're bound to smell a rat." "I tell you what, Mum, I'll come with you," says Hamish, my son. "That way, if you take a picture of them, you could pretend you're taking a picture of me." "All right. It might not be a bad idea. You can come along then." Hamish's account. I was excited to be going sleuthing with my mother. I fancied the idea of following a man around who my mother insisted was having an affair, outside his own marriage, with his attractive secretary Sonia from work. But she needed photographic evidence to give to her client Elaine. Thereby her client could confront her husband George with a tangible proof of his indiscretions, and then file for divorce. My father was less than enamoured about my mother doing this outlandish job on a limb like this. I could tell that even though I was 16 at the time, he was a lot happier that I was going along for the ride. While my brother Knox wanted nothing to do with such venturesome activities, he infinitely preferred to read up all about things like this in his wild detective novels, where villains are always incarcerated and the hero emerges through the debris and chaos of a gruesome murder, like a heralded knight in shining armour. My mother could be impetuous at the very best of times, with an unbridled lack of self-restraint that could land her in some really precarious, tricky situations if she wasn't careful enough. Worse still, my mother did have a wagging tongue that needed to be reined in at times. You don't earn a reputation as a town gossip for nothing, and my mother's tongue was agile in its flexibility, that was for sure. My mother had informed me that this gentleman we were spying on called George Farrell. That's if you can actually call him that. In my opinion, the word gentleman is deservedly earned. It's not given to the dregs of society that are not worthy of such illustrious acclaim, based on their abysmal self-conduct and their shabby treatment towards the fairer sex. But enough said about that. I had seen George in church many times before, and even on first impression, I had never warmed to him. My mother believed he was a narcissistic personality type. I believe she was right. He wore such a smug, conceited expression on his face, as if the whole world owed him a living. I also discerned that he didn't have many male friends, but the less discerning woman would swoon over him, based on his very good looks. That I did notice. It was based on my mother's hunch that me and my mother were seated on the edge of a dirt road, not far from the Farrell farmhouse, where we parked under a couple of tall oak trees, hoping to be inconspicuous. It was a Friday night, and at about 9:20, but my mother and I tuned into the radio and drank some hot coffees we had purchased at the petrol station earlier on, with a couple of doughnuts. It was quite a dark night, and there was a gentle wind blowing, but once it got to 11:30, my mother was about to call it a night. "I'm sorry, Hamish, my hunch was obviously wrong," she says, starting up the car with a disappointed edge to her voice. "Hold on, Mum," I point out to her excitedly. "There's a car leaving the Farrell residence right now." My mother said nothing. We surreptitiously followed the white BMW on the long dirt road, keeping a fair distance behind, so that George, who was clearly the driver, didn't know he was being shadowed. My mother's car rolled past two cars parked outside the local woodgrove a little later on, a red Cooper Mini and George's white BMW, in an area popular with hikers and dog walkers alike. The white BMW obviously belonged to George, and at a guess the red Cooper must have belonged to Sonia, his secretary. Me and my mother were surprised at the secret rendezvous. Why would the couple meet in the woodgrove in the middle of the night like this? My mother remembered that Elaine informed her that her husband George comes back from his late-night soirees with hay and moss in his hair. "Of course," my mother says. "That makes sense now. They come here as George's secretary Sonia is also married. Why didn't I think of that before? I noticed she was wearing a wedding ring at the restaurant, but I just didn't put two and two together." Maybe here in the Woodgrove it's easier to keep their affair secret away from the prying eyes of the locals. But I am rather bewildered that Sonia's husband doesn't appear to notice his wife is sneaking out. Well, there could be a simple explanation for it. Maybe she puts sleeping tablets into his coffee. Or perhaps he just nods off in front of the television and is a very deep sleeper. Doesn't notice his wife disappearing. My mother pulls in her car beside the red Mini Cooper and finally parks. We're going to creep into the forest, she says, and we're going to spy on them. Think of it like a military expedition, where we're making our way discreetly across enemy lines. We cannot be caught. Do you understand that? I want you to make absolutely certain you run slowly from tree to tree and try not to make any sound. If the worst comes to the worst and they see my flash going off and catch us in an unguarded moment, we'll pretend we're taking pictures of each other. As they don't have a monopoly over the Woodgrove, it's a free country. Lots of people go for late-night walks and strolls, coon or coyote hunting as well, so we have got as much right to be here as they have. My guess is they're canoodling on a rug in the Woodgrove, drinking wine together and talking. If they're too absorbed in each other, a couple of clicks from my camera is unlikely to get their attention. They might look up and say, "What was that?" We have to be clever, very clever about this. Let's not kid, it's a beautiful night. Even if it's all but a little chilly, I really want you, son, to be so quiet. Move with the rustles of the wind, not against them, as any isolated sounds might just draw attention to us, and that we don't want. We must use the sounds of nature to our advantage, as our crutch, working with them, not against them. Me and my mother climb cautiously out of her white Honda Accord, closing the car doors very silently. She hands me a torch, which I receive from her gratefully. I'm going to need this light. It is tenebrously dark out here. There's a biting chill in the air that nips at my skin unkindly. The moon is hiding her pearly luminescence behind some cloud cover that has even shrouded the silvery stars of the firmament tonight, so that the velvety blackness beyond our torchlight is hostile, very unfriendly. My mother and I discreetly scramble up a slight hilly embankment, where jagged rocks angrily jut out of the grassy verge. We walk across a grassy clearing and head down the familiar cleared trail of the Woodgrove, enjoyed by so many during the day. The last time I'd been in this Woodgrove late at night was when I was 10 years old. I had forgotten how intimidating the dark could be, as looming shadows seemed to pounce at us through the trees, with the stealth and cunning of a black leopard, and all the while it felt as if this dusky penumbra was clandestinely coiling itself around the forest like a great big predatory anaconda, which was more than a little disarming. At first I had been remarkably excited about this sleuthing, which sounded a little bit like fun to me. But now, as me and my mother crept into this Woodgrove, darting carefully from one tree to another, like two soldiers in military exercise, let's just say my heart was thundering violently in my chest. I could hear every booming beat. Even so, I was glad I was here with my mother. It gave me a measure of reassurance that we had each other's backs. What was the worst, after all, that could actually happen? We could be caught taking pictures of the couple. But that was not what I was actually afraid of. It was something else. It was an uneasy, unsettling feeling that trickled down my spine like a single icy-cold raindrop. I secretly wondered if my perceptive, discerning mother could feel it too. Nothing ever escaped my mother's attention. She always noticed things. Something felt distinctly wrong about this Woodgrove tonight, as if something was out of alignment. And that was when it dawned on me. There were no crickets and frogs serenading the night with their regular, familiar, tuneful chorus. Wasn't that more than a little odd? Why was the forest so quiet tonight? The stillness itself sprinkled the forest with a sense of foreboding, showers of trepidation that nagged at my intuition, arousing my senses to a state of high alert. The whispering wind that whistled through the trees only added to the bodeful ambience. It felt as if between every dark shadow, eyes buried themselves beneath the shrouded blanket of twilight. It felt as if me and my mother were being watched. But by what? Without the light of my torch, I don't mind confessing that I would never have had the guts to go into this Woodgrove tonight. As devoid of the silvery shafts of moonlight, that would normally soften the dusky wilderness with a subtle ethereal light, I would not have been able to enter this space. The moon seemed tucked away tonight by a smouldering cloud cover. Aside from anything else, although the ground beneath our feet was soft and spongy to the touch, we pressed our rubber soles on the path as quietly as we could, ambling into the heart of the woods, moving with the sounds of the wind, so that we would sound ourselves like the rustling leaves. There were gnarled, angry roots that jutted out their uneven, bulky appendages from the forest floor, like hungry tentacles waiting to grab an unsuspecting foot. But luckily we managed to bypass their eager traps. The trees tonight were like dark, unfriendly cardboard cutouts of immense stature and girth that thrust their powerful contours into the dark expanse, moved their heavy boughs, that rustled in the wind like cheerleaders' pom-poms. My mother is indicating for me to follow her. She's telling me to switch off my torch, and I know why. I hear muffled laughter and voices, one male, one female. Who in their right mind would think it was romantic canoodling in the woodgrove on a night like this, when the entire forest is privy to your infidelity, while every tree, every green leafy fern, every shrub is eyewitness to your treachery, as let's just say, the forest is alive. All these trees are silent witnesses. My mother's hands are trembling with excitement as she holds on to her camera. We position ourselves behind a large oak tree. The couple are cast in a bright light, as several portable battery-operated lights have illuminated the picnic space, so we can see them pretty well. The couple appear to be doing up buttons, so I'm glad we missed the start of this movie. They're now sitting down on a rug drinking wine, clinking wine glasses, occasionally kissing. It would seem that any photographs my mother now takes will definitely confirm George Farrell's infidelity, but she needs to be careful, very careful. My mother manages to snap a picture. The couple become nervous and edgy. "What's that?" said the woman, looking around herself. "Something flashed. Did you see it?" "It's probably nothing," said the man, putting his arms lovingly around the woman. The woman shakes her long hair. "Something's off about this forest tonight. It feels different. It feels like we're being watched." "Right," laughs the man. "I think it's your imagination, playing tricks on you. It's possibly because the moon is hiding her face tonight behind some cloud cover. It's naturally going to make the forest seem daunting." All of a sudden, the remorseless sound of prodigious heavy feet thunder violently through the forest, becoming incredibly conspicuous. There is a palpable sense that something big is hurtling towards us. It sounds like a furious, incandescent rhino with an axe to grind. It is charging, tearing, and hurling itself through the briary thicket, like a train on full throttle, and nothing is sacred in its path. I can hear this incongruous being, whatever in God's name it is, breaking off branches on its strident approach, that hit the ground with loud, clamorous thumping sounds that bounce, roll, and heave. The sound echoes ominously through the woods. The woman is shaking. "What is that, George? What is it? Something's coming! Whatever it is, it's very, very big!" Even in the soft shadows of artificial light, I can see George is trembling. His face has paled significantly. The colour is extinguished from his skin. He looks exactly like a small, frightened schoolboy, shuddering in his boots, afraid of the tsunami of aggression that is violently moving towards us. It's as if time stands very still, for no feet even attempt to run away, as if for a brief moment they are frozen to the spot in absolute, unadulterated terror. I know that for me, my heart has jumped into my throat. My whole body has become estranged from me, like a stranger I don't know and am not acquainted with. Every muscle in my body has become rigidly solid and tough, hardened, unyielding, like cement, grossly incapable of responding to my urgent instincts that are screaming for me to run and run as fast as I can, away from this scene. I can taste the danger on my tongue before I can even see it. Then there he is, standing yards away from George, and of course his love interest Sonia. I know at once what this creature is. It's a Bigfoot, but this has got to be the most terrifying beast that I have ever beheld. This is one hell of an angry Bigfoot. I could swear even smoke is emerging from his flared nostrils. He is glaring at both Sonia and George, with indignant red eyeshine that is terrifying to behold. He looks like a creature that could have descended from the gates of hell itself. All he needs in his hand is a pitchfork, and that would do very nicely. Shadows of the battery-operated light are cast over the creature so he can clearly be distinguished in great detail. I would say he's easily over 9 foot tall, 4 foot wide across the shoulder area, and let's just say he would break your bathroom scale. He weighs that much. He's built like an army tank, powerful, lofty, mighty, strong. His human-like face is dappled with primate influences. The creature lunges confidently towards both Sonia and George, screaming at them so loudly that the ear-piercing murderous noise cuts through bone, marrow and sinew, and could so easily shatter glass. Sonia screams. She grabs a torch and runs through the woodgrove, with George running behind her. The creature grabs George by the collar of his shirt, pulling off half of his collar, which is dangling in his hands. He throws George to the ground. George lets out a discomposing scream, so terrifying that it plunders through the forest like a high-pitched warning siren. George is trembling, but manages to pull himself up from the ground. How he does this, I can't fathom. He seems to find his feet, but look like he's wading through treacherous muddy water, and is awkwardly stumbling all over the place, like a heavy piece of ungainly, cumbersome furniture. The Bigfoot is screaming. He points to the picnic blanket, to the wine glasses, the artificial lights. The creature is stamping his feet belligerently, massaging his chest with powerful punches, as if to exert his dominance. George attempts to run away again, but his legs seem to give way beneath him. The creature is furious, dragging him back by the scruff of the neck, pulling him across the ground. The sound of my mother's voice breaks the silence. "Pick up your picnic stuff, George, right now. Get the hell out of this forest or he'll kill you. You're trespassing on his land. He wants you to remove your stuff and go. Then he won't hurt you." George is surprised to hear my mother's voice, and obediently gathers his things together. My mother dashes out from the tree she's been hiding behind to help him, paying very little regard to her own safety, as she's confident the Bigfoot means us no harm, as long as we get the hell out of the forest and pick up the mess. I stumble away from my hiding place to help. George gathers his stuff off the ground. It feels like being at a boarding school and being caught having a midnight feast on the school grounds by a disagreeable, cantankerous headmistress who is hovering over us to get everything cleared up. The Bigfoot has calmed down significantly. He's grunting to himself. And then the three of us walk through the forest with the Bigfoot walking behind us, escorting us out of the place to make absolutely certain we leave. I can see the red Mini Cooper has already left. The Bigfoot clearly wanted us out of his forest now. My mother was right. Did it surprise me she could read his body language? Absolutely not. She had assessed that in his eyes we were trespassers who needed to take our things and go. We had no right to be there as far as he was concerned. My mother knew exactly what the Bigfoot wanted from us. If George had failed to understand him in any way, he might be pushing up the daisies, even as I speak, as he may have tried the Bigfoot's patience every time by running away. So let's just say I marvelled at my mother's ability to read between the lines, as I believe she saved George's life. I hasten to say he must have agreed, as he sent my mother a huge bouquet of flowers which read, "You saved my skin. Thank you very much." To cut a long story short, Elaine was able to get a divorce from George, with the evidence from one single photograph of my mother's that she'd taken in the woodgrove that night. But after the event with the Bigfoot, George's reputation of being the town philanderer had calmed down significantly. It was like that scare with the Bigfoot had shifted something inside him, made him a more compassionate human being. My mother firmly believes his days of cheating are long behind him. She's seen the haughty cockiness in his body language has changed. I believe he's now remarried, but his love interest with Sonia died the moment she absconded from that forest in her red Mini Cooper and failed to get him any help, claiming no one would have ever believed her preposterous story, and in her opinion George was already dead, so why should she bother calling for help? I think George was so appalled that day He woke up to the fact that cheating might not be quite so fun after all, as he had thrown away a loving wife with the bathwater who would never have treated him with such disregard. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.